Will you talk, Sean?
The Wars of the Roses are not only a major inspiration for the events of A Song of Ice and Fire, but also the Dance of the Dragons and lots of Martin's writing. It's one of his favorite periods of history, and this is not an obscure interest on his part. The Wars of the Roses are an extremely popular period because the events that really happened make for excellent stories as they happened, without embellishment. Of course, that hasn't stopped people from embellishing them, George included. I mean, he's not retelling actual history, but he takes the most fun parts, makes them more fun, more dramatic, more conflicting, maybe more bloody, what have you. But there have been countless retellings and dramatizations of the Wars of the Roses. Long before George R. R. Martin used it as an inspiration, Shakespeare wrote eight different plays on the Wars of the Roses because so many of the characters and events and were just that compelling, and it, encompasses a very large amount of time, over 30 years. And now other playwrights besides Shakespeare have as well. It's hard to be as famous as him, but it's been done, not to mention books and movies, etc. Pretty much everything. As vivid as the stories and as endless as the selections are, for our purposes, it's just as important to note that the histories themselves, not just the stories, are highly detailed and accurate. The end of the Wars of the Roses, which is 1487, it's debated when it actually ends. Wars don't just ever come to a complete stop. There's always things still happening, grievances, more context here and there. But importantly, in history, the end of the Wars of the Roses marks the end of the Middle Ages, aka the medieval era in England. It kind of ends in different times and different places, but roughly that's the mark for England. Now, think about how much more recent this is than other things we've studied or compared. For example, Hadrian's Wall. We talked about that in our Song of Ice and Fire in Rome episode last year, or earlier this year, rather. And it's a huge inspiration for the Wall of Westeros. Hadrian's Wall was finished like 128 AD. That's like 1900 years ago. Today we're talking about events from about 550 to 600 years ago. Mostly. There's some context that'll take us out of that span, but mostly just 5 to 6 centuries ago. So we're closer to that than they are to Hadrian's Wall, right? Like, this is closer to our timeline than their timeline is to some of these other more ancient things we've talked about. And that means they have an unusual amount of accuracy, reliability of sources on a greater level than is perhaps typical. For example, we have the precise dates of many events, births, deaths, and such, like November 1st, Henry landed with his army, things like that. Like, we know the dates, like, specifically. We sometimes have the hour, like 3 o'clock, the battle began. So it's that's something that's I can't say enough about that really helps us dig in here. So our presentation of the Wars of the Roses here will differ in that it will be not relayed like a traditional historian or fan of the history. It's going to be through the eyes of George's creations. We're going to be loading you with parallels and helping to tell the story with these parallels. The underlying inspirations will serve as shortcuts to understanding. For example, when I tell you that Richard, the third Duke of York, was like Rickard Stark a bit, that already fast forwards you through a lot of the information you need about this character. Obviously, they're not identical. Yeah, their names are similar. That helps too. But anyway, other characters we'll see paralleled today include Ned, his brother Brandon, all three Baratheon brothers, the Mad King, Baelor the Blessed, King Aenys, King Viserys, the first, that is, Cersei, Sansa, Tywin, houses like Lannister, Stark, Tyrell, Targaryen, and events like the Redgrass Field and the Battle of the Trident. It's perhaps the richest vein of parallels and inspirations we have from a single historical slice. We have all that, them, and those, and more on this episode of History of Westeros podcast. Hello and welcome, everybody, to another fun episode of History of Westeros podcast. This episode is brought to you by our patrons and Topic Smoot 2024, where this topic was selected early this year in 2024, and it's helping spur more discussions and thoughts for topics when we do this next year for Topic Smoot 2025 in February. So join us on Patreon if you want to participate in the voting / selection process for episodes that get made. We'll be doing at least 12 topics that will get made in 2025. We are live streaming almost every Sunday at 3 Eastern. You can catch that on YouTube, and you can catch it afterwards on Spotify or watch the replay on YouTube. And you can catch the audio anywhere you listen to podcasts. And all of our shows are ad-free if you watch them on Patreon. Audio only, unfortunately. We have no way to make our YouTube videos ad-free. The only way to do that is to become a YouTube subscriber through them, not through us. Anyway, Sean, how's it going, my man? Haven't had you on in a few weeks. Good to have you back. What's going on?
Yeah, it's good to be here. I got to say, this topic is very intriguing. I started off having some like superficial historical context for the Wars of the Roses and some superficial knowledge that George had based some stuff on it. And when I first started digging into it, one of the first things I saw that George did that actually happened in history is name a bunch of people the same name.
Yeah. Yes, so true.
You think it's confusing with all the Aegons and Aemons or whatever. It's preposterous how many Richards and Edwards and Edmonds and Henrys there. It's just crazy.
It's preposterous. And that's the right word, preposterous.
Yeah. This span, this war, the war itself is a 30-ish year span, but of course there's like context. At the beginning of the war, some of these people are children and some of them are adults, and over 30 years there's some transitioning there. New people are born, and they just keep naming each other Henry and Richard, and their brothers are named Richard, and like
it's not a whole lot better with the womenens names either. There's lots of Annes and Margarets and Elizabeths. Yeah.
It's not as bad.
It's not as bad.
Not,
you're right.
Exactly. Yeah.
Whereas I feel,
anyway,
I was going to say, Sean, I feel that in A Song of Ice and Fire, for a lot of people, those names are just totally alien to them, which makes it even harder sometimes to follow. Yeah. And I was telling Aziz that I feel that the Last Kingdom era is the most difficult for me because it's all these Ethelfleds and Ethelreds and like it's both alien to me and unfamiliar, and it's repetitive.
And repetitive, yes. Yeah, at least Edward doesn't sound like Richard.
Yeah, like, I know what Edward is. Yeah.
Yeah. It's true. What you're saying, Sean, is very true. Like, I have roses coming out of my ears because I swear I've never put more. I haven't had to put this much work into a topic before. I always put a lot of work into our episodes, but like this one, I had to learn a lot more. Like A Song of Ice and Fire, I'm in and out of that for decades. So, but this is different.
That's the point I was about to make. Also, is I don't think I've ever put as much research into one of our topics, it's interesting. Like there's so many rabbit holes to go down. Like there's so many of these characters, and like you were saying, like. It's so well documented, right? This period of time is so much better documented and preserved. And so there just is so much information of it. And so much of it is intriguing or complicated or connected to other things. Because this is coming right out of the 100 Years' War.
Yeah.
Like Henry VI, one of the central characters here, he's king through his kingship is in contention is kind of what the whole thing is about. But he was crowned as a boy. And it was actually crowned as both King of England and France. That's one thing about this is that England and France, through a lot of history, were kind of co-ruled by the same people, and a lot of shifting. A lot of history is about that. But anyway, he was King of England and France during the 100 Years' War, but as a boy. But becomes an adult and has bouts of insanity through all this. Anyway, my point is that. It's connected to a lot of other stuff that you kind of need to learn a little bit about for context. And so as I was researching this, at one point I had like 14 tabs open on my computer, mostly Wikipedia rabbit holes I was going through, but I was trying to find like visual imagery to get it in my brain better to distinguish between all these Richards. Like, it's again, like the Targaryens, like the family trees are complicated because there's all these cousins and
even keeping track of your own tabs gets difficult at that point because they all start with Richard or Edward. Like, wait, which Richard am I clicking on here?
Richard III, Richard the Third, Duke of York, they're different people, And so a few days later, I still have 14 tabs open, and they're all different. 14 new different tabs open.
That's amazing.
It's so much information.
Yeah, it's like A Song of Ice and Fire. Like my first time reading it, I didn't grasp what the lesser houses were doing, how important they were. It's just enough to keep track of Ned and Robert and Catelyn and Sansa. But then when you reread and third read and fourth, that's when some of these things start to come out. So that's what I had to do with this, was just go over it multiple times. It sounds like you had to as well.
At first I was like just overwhelmed, but as I started like taking my own notes and kind of getting some of the names down, some of the context leading up to the Wars of the Roses helped me like differentiate the different Henrys and Richards and stuff. And as it started to sink in more, I started to become more invested in the characters and the stories, right? And sometimes even like there's different takes on some of these characters depending on the time period, the perspective, or what source you're reading. And so every now and then I would read, Richard of Warwick is one way to distinguish some of the Richards. I would read an article say he was very ambitious and his errors, and I'm like, what? He was a freaking champion. What are you talking about?
You got your own opinion, yeah.
And then someone would die in a battle. I'm like, oh, really?
Damn.
I can't believe it,
Yeah, and that's what we were saying in the intro about how it really does read like it's really compelling just the way it is without embellishment, just that. But let's start back at the beginning. We're fire hosing already because that's the nature of this material.
Can I say one more quick thing? There's 30 more quick things I want to say, but the one thing I want to say is that I was blown away by how often these kings rode into battle and were killed in battle. Like they weren't just in some ivory tower sending your armies off. They were going out and doing it. And I was really surprised.
It's an important part of the English monarchy to be a war leader. That was like a primary duty of them. And of course, like as we'll see, this Henry that we start with, not so much that. and that's putting it mildly. Anyway, so in addition to all of our work on this and fire hosing both you all and ourselves with this information, it has become a lot clearer, and it makes the story a lot easier to tell through this lens of A Song of Ice and Fire. Nina was a big help as well. She's a big fan of the Wars of the Roses. Check her out at goodqueenally.tumblr.com. That's 1L in Alley. The latest blog post over there is a question about Eleanor Penrose. Eleanor was a cousin of Aerys, and we're not sure how she's connected to Aerys. So that's part of the question there is guessing at what that familial connection might be. If you have questions for us, send them to us at westeroshistory@gmail.com or interact with us on Discord or our Facebook group, or you can send them to us live if you're watching this live. Shout out to Sheen Onslager Jensen, who got our trivia question in the Facebook group right last time. And we will continue with our trivia questions most weeks. Not this one, though, because we have so much to cover. I decided to trim a little bit so we'd have more time. So let's not get hung up on that. We have a lot to cover. We have George's love of this period. We have George's love of Shakespeare, but don't trust Shakespeare on any of this because, again, embellishments. We have the real history to correct us. We don't have to rely on the fictional accounts, though those do matter because the fictional accounts influence George. The real history is only part of the story because we're getting at the influence. The influence George can be influenced by a completely false story that he knows is false. If it's a good story, he can use it in his world. So completely made up stuff has its place as long as we, acknowledge it as that. That's kind of useful.
It's worth noting that Shakespeare or whoever wasn't necessarily just completely making stuff
right.
up. They didn't necessarily have all the facts. Like we have the perspective of history and documentation from all around to piece together the truth. So something that was a story in Shakespeare's time there's no reason for him to question it, really.
Right.
And now, not to say he didn't also make some stuff up. But.
And there were some politics in mind. Like there was a Lancastrian descendant on the throne when he was most active. So certain things you just didn't want to do or say to insult the monarch. Yeah, just smart to not piss off the king or queen, right? So we'll do a Wars of the Roses overview. That's going to be the bulk of this episode. Is we're going to tell the story of the Wars of the Roses. We'll do it in sections. We'll have little miniature discussions after each little part. We sort of did little milestones and chapters all the way along. Then we'll do some detailed character and house parallels if we have time for that, and then a little bit of talk about George's favorite author for this period, and one of my favorite authors for this period as well, Sharon K. Penman. She has done a lot of historical fiction work, particularly The Sun in Splendor, a name that will pop up a few times during our telling of the story. You'll understand the significance shortly if you don't already. Let us start with a quote from the man himself, George R. Martin. Here we go.
Thank you. In broad terms, the action in A Game of Thrones and its sequels is definitely informed by The War of the Roses, one of my favorite historical periods. It's not a one-to-one correspondence, however. I had considerable fun playing with expectations and mixing things up, and the characters grew more from my own head than from history.
That's right, and it's a good way to set our expectations. Again, George is free to do whatever he wants. These are inspirations, not guidelines for him, right? He can do whatever, and he has done whatever, but nevertheless, you will see a lot of the parallels and inspirations as we go through this. George also follows that quote up by saying, special mention goes to Thomas B. Costain's 4-volume history of the Plantagenets, however. Thomas B. Costain, you might recognize that name. There's a House Costain in Westeros. They're a vassal of the Hightowers, if I recall correctly.
And we asked George in our interview if that was a reference to Thomas Costain, and he's like, I don't know. I don't think so. He couldn't remember.
He's like, probably, though, you know. Now, and especially because the Costain sigil is a lion, which the lion sigil is a big part of this. The Lancastrians
The Costain sigil is not a lion.
A sleeping lion, isn't it?
No, you're thinking of Grandison.
I'm thinking of Grandison, you're right.
Costain is the cup and the rose, a quartered cup and rose. The
rose is an even better symbol for this.
I cosplayed a Costain, so I will always remember their sigil.
You're right. Thanks for the correction, and it's a good one because the rose is an even better symbol here because the rose is an even bigger sigil for this than the lion, as you might guess, given it's the Wars of the Roses. So one thing we're going to also do during this, and I encourage you all to do the same, pick your favorite parallel. There's going to be so many parallels here. I want to hear from you all. I'm going to ask Sean as well, and Ashea, if she's got one, she can weigh in at the end, what we think the strongest parallel to A Song of Ice and Fire here, whether it's a character, an event. It's probably going to be a character, but it doesn't have to be. I already know what mine is, and it is a character. But so you all let us know. We'll have places for you to do that. You can put it in the comments, whether you're listening to a podcast or watching on YouTube. You should have that choice.
Can I say one quick kind of setup overview thing?
Absolutely.
I don't know if we mentioned in the document. Most of our listeners probably are aware of this already, but the centerpiece of this is the Lancasters versus the Yorks, which is the Lannisters versus the Starks, right? I don't know if we ever say that in here, but
we do. But it's good to clarify right at the beginning.
Yeah. And that was another thing through the course of researching this, that they don't always call each other. They almost never call the characters Lancasters and Yorks. They call them by like the land or the house that they're in, but they are arranged in these sort of factions. And that was something that was kind of hard to keep up with throughout it. So I might make an effort to remind us where we're at as we go through this.
Absolutely. If Sean's asking for clarification, I know will help you all as well keep your names straight. And that's why I've also gone through the effort of giving these characters Song of Ice and Fire nicknames. We're going to call Richard, 3rd Duke of York, Richard Rickard, because he's like Rickard Stark. And we're going to call one of the Edwards Edward Joffrey, because he's like Joffrey. And another one is Edward Robert, because he's like Robert Baratheon. So that's going to really help you all understand this, because you are, like I said in the intro, preloaded with the Song of Ice and Fire knowledge, whereas some of this other stuff might be completely new or almost entirely new. So and following up on the Lancaster York bit, it's confusing because those names don't 100% correspond to the geographical names that exist. For example, York, you would think that's related to the city of York. It used to be, but House of York is less associated with the city of York than they used to be. So don't think too hard about that. We're not going to delve into that much of the territories other than generalities. That's a layer of difficulty we're not going to tackle today. So yeah, technology and law, that we got to throw a few notes about that here because it is different than Westeros. Westeros is, people go too far with the medieval comparison, but it is the closest comparison, medieval world. Now, medieval is a 1,000-year period. The medieval period includes the year 500 AD all the way to 1500-ish. There's clocks and cannons and gunpowder weapons in this era, whereas there weren't in the year 500 or 600 or 700. So there's massive differences even within the Middle Ages in technology. I think the closest parallel to gunpowder weapons is wildfire in A Song of Ice and Fire. Maybe some of the Red Priest powers. Melisandre just made Orell catch fire in the air. That's kind of gunpowdery. It feels like a targeted weapon system. And of course, dragons. Those count as modern warfare in a sense.
And it's also worth noting that gunpowder existed. They had cannons, but it wasn't prominent.
Right.
Horses and swords, that was still like the main armies.
Yeah, definitely. But we will see some of the technology even change during the story. Printing presses had only been invented about 15 years prior to the Wars of the Roses. So those hadn't had a huge effect yet, but that it became huge pretty quickly because of the proliferation of things like, well, Bibles and just notices. Like people could send out newsletters and things like that, political newsletters and things like that. Kings had less power. This is a big important point here. Kings, this is past the era of the Magna Carta. England has a parliament, and that parliament is powerful. Its power has changed over time. It's more powerful now than it was then. The kings are way less powerful now than they were back then, and parliament is way more powerful. But even back then, the parliament had a lot of power. It's the highest judiciary, so it's the judicial branch. So it can solve things like whose claim is better. Sometimes that is solved by fighting, but sometimes it's adjudicated. The other really big thing that gave the parliament narrow but very meaningful power was they got to decide whether to fund military campaigns or not. So if the king wants to go to war, the parliament has a button they can push that says no by not funding it. Now, of course, the king has a lot of power to force that button to get pushed. A lot of levers they can pull behind the scenes, threatening people and inducing, but basically
if their allies are strong enough, they might fund it themselves or whatever.
Yeah, so it's a check on the monarchy. It's certainly not an all-encompassing everything to stop it or hold it in place. All right, so yeah, let's get to the main event here. The Wars of the Roses. As Sean said, Lancaster and York are the two at odds here. The term Wars of the Roses did not exist at the time. It was a later invention, kind of a marketing thing, like a really sexy name to give to it, which definitely has helped it stand out a bit more over the test of time because it's a really cool name.
At the time, it was just called the Civil Wars, right?
Yeah, the Civil Wars, yes. So look at these two sigils on screen that Ashay has put up. The red rose for the Lancasters, the white rose for the Yorks. They're very similar to each other, and they look a lot like the Tyrell rose, don't they?
Oh, that's what it is.
Yeah, that is very intentional. And you can also tell that one is flipped up, like the 5 points of the star, kind of like a star, I should say, are pointed up for the red and down for the white. That also has some significance, but it will come up later. So think of all the variations we've seen, not just of the Targaryen banner, but other banners, like little personalized versions of these, like House Blackfire. They flip the colors. That's kind of like what we're seeing here a little bit. Aegon II's golden dragon rather than the red dragon or black dragon of the Blackfires. Rhaenyra quartered her dragons with falcon and seahorse. You get the idea. These kind of variations were all over the place.
We can't not mention the flaming heart of Stannis.
Yeah, of course. That's not very similar to a stag, but there is a stag in it. So yeah, that's a very different one. So yeah, it was something like 350 years when the term War of the Roses came. The Quarrel of the Roses was the first title, but that even came only more like 200 years afterwards. So yeah, even then. It lasted from 1455 to 1487. You can imagine it more like if Robert's Rebellion encompassed the events of the War of Five Kings, and that was considered all part of one conflict. But also like the 100 Years' War, which was just before this, like 3 years before this, 2.5 years. It was an actual constant war the entire time, just like there was not a lot of war between Robert's Rebellion and the War of the Five Kings. But there were things that happened that were very relevant to the finishing of the first and the starting of the second. Drawing some lines in the sand, basically. Another major cause was bastard feudalism. It has nothing to do with bastards, but it's a term that means only like 100 to 200 years before, the new phase of of nobility happened, which was that Edward III, who almost everyone in the story descends from this Edward III guy, started just creating a new rank, dukes. He started creating dukes, duchies. They didn't really exist before. And he's like, let's make these. This was a terrible idea. George wished he used duke instead of high lord because it's kind of the equivalent term. So he also had a regret on this, but only the term, not the use of it, because he did use it, just he wished he named it differently. So what this means is these were like miniature kingdoms that a king or a queen or a royal house would give to a son, including the first son, but also the second, the third, and daughters too would get these sometimes. And these were little miniature fiefs that had enough power to challenge royal authority eventually. And that's what happened. So you'd have these like miniature kingdoms that starting their own wars and challenging royal power and creating all these succession crises. And that is the backdrop of the end of the 100 Years' War that sets us up. Now, the 100 Years' War was fought between Plantagenet and Valois. The Wars of the Roses was fought between two cadet branches of Plantagenet. That's Lancaster and York. Some really huge historical events happened during the 100 Years' War that kind of help you understand the setting here, like the Black Death. That happened during the 100 Years' War. It was a pretty huge event. Like, that wiped out almost half the population of Europe. Some estimates have it even higher than that. Joan of Arc happened during this time. Joan of Arc was a big deal because she was motivated to get the English out of France. And England versus France was a huge part of all this. Plantagenet's defeat in the 100 Years' War was marked by the loss of, it said, all their lands in France. Technically, they still had a little slice here and there, but basically they lost all their French possessions. The king at the time was this Henry VI of House Lancaster, again, a cadet branch of the original Plantagenets. So at this point, the end of the 100 Years' War, probably because of this astonishing loss, this final result that causes them to lose their major French possessions, which they had held for centuries, by the way, he had a mental breakdown. Modern historians and scientists don't really know what to label his illness. It's strange. He went fully catatonic. Basically, he just wouldn't respond. It's like you telling your little child, put your shoes on, and they just don't respond. And you're like, put your shoes on. They don't respond. And you just keep, a day later, they still won't put their shoes on. They aren't eating. You try to hold food up to their mouth and like you have to shove it in their mouth and maybe a little of it trickles down their throat. But this is otherwise a living, breathing man. He's not in a coma. His eyes are blinking. He moves, but he's just catatonic. He just won't respond to anything. And go ahead.
He even has a son born.
Yeah.
In this moment.
He has a son born.
Like a year
yeah.
or so long, and he has a son born. And he doesn't even respond to his son being born. He's just somehow oblivious to what's going on in the world.
It's very strange, and it's a huge problem. Like, if this was just some random guy, it's not a big deal. This is the king. This causes central authority to begin to crumble and erode. Reduction in freedoms triggers revolts throughout the country, and there's a variety of social, economic, and political issues. Now, this wasn't just all of a sudden. These issues had been burbling up all throughout Henry's reign because he was so soft and weak. It just got a lot worse when he went from weak to just nothing, almost. Like, there was a true puppet, with a puppet who couldn't be puppeted because he didn't respond to any stimuli whatsoever.
Like, I feel like it's worth noting here that there's a key character, Edmund Beaufort.
Yeah.
They use this term lieutenant. He was lieutenant of France. There was a lieutenant of Ireland and so on. And that's almost like governor. It's almost what that word means at this time. And that title was kind of like governor. And it was under his rule when Henry VI was still just a boy, but he was the governor of France at the tail end of the 100 Years' War when they lost all this territory. And that also, like you said, because they had held it for hundreds of years, that kind of made the populace of England was kind of upset. Like, what the heck? We're losing 100 years war.
It's like a sports team that's like, we lost again.
Guy.
Yeah.
Beaufort.
Exactly.
Beaufort. Yeah, Beaufort. Yes.
Beaufort is the American pronunciation, which you would be used to for lots of southeastern places, but not for the UK.
That's right. We have a Beaufort Highway here, but it's not Beaufort
Highway.
We
changed the spelling too, yeah.
So that's a great point. Sean is right that Edmund Beaufort, hugely important. So is his son, Edmund Beaufort, and other relations of his like Margaret. There's lots of Beauforts in this story. They're a very important house. I don't have a strong parallel house to name to them. You could maybe say they're the Lannisters of Lannisport, because they're the lesser Lannisters, but still very important. Although, to be fair, the lesser Lannisters aren't that important in A Song of Ice and Fire.
This Edmund guy is a cousin to Henry.
Yeah.
And has a sort of a claim to the throne, theoretically, not a strong one. And there's another cousin, a key character, Richard, who has a stronger claim, much stronger. Is what's the word? Heir apparent?
Heir
right?
presumptive. Let's describe the difference.
If Henry has a kid, that'll be the new heir. But until then, this Richard guy is
right.
But
heir apparent means you are going to inherit unless you die. Heir presumptive means you are the heir but someone could be born that jumps over you. Like in this case, like if the king has his own son, then that kid becomes first.
So a couple of the little nuances I think are worth mentioning here is that it's sort of like England has lost this French territory, but that's still kind of blurry because England and France have shared rulers for hundreds of years. So it's almost, maybe it was French in the first place, or maybe and they're getting it back, but maybe it was England kind of belonged to France in the first place.
And they're all cousins of each other too, right? They're all like related and intermarried, and
there's some relative and semantic stuff going on here. But one way or the other, the people of England feel like that's their land that they've lost in this 100 Years' War, and they're kind of blaming this Henry. Just happened to be the king at the time, but he was a kid when this was, was born into this. But this Beaufort guy was an adult who was in charge and lost. But some of the stuff that he lost, some of it was through like lost battles, but some of it was just negotiating for peace. They just wanted to end the 100 Years' War. So maybe he should get some credit for losing the land but saving innocent people's lives.
Yeah, whether he deserved it or not, he got hammered over it. The nobility used it against him. A lot of it was probably legitimate, but some of it was probably just political to push him down a step. But also, like you said, the commoners were very upset and fired up about it.
Another interesting, ironic thing about this is that this Henry VI, he was the only person ever crowned king of England and France. And then right afterwards, they lost France.
Yeah.
But his wife was French, and they're Margaret, and she's a key character because as he's losing sanity and power, she's picking it up, and you can see maybe some parallels to some Game of Thrones characters for her.
Yeah, she's a Cersei for sure in a lot of ways.
I don't disagree, but I also see some elements of Alicent in her. I wasn't thinking about it till just before we started this recording.
I agree, and frankly, a little bit of Daenerys and some of the like stronger leaders who lead like she led armies and stuff like that a little bit. I mean, she wasn't super skilled at it, but she did it, which is very noteworthy. But there is some suspicion on her as she tries to take power because she's from France and they feel like they just lost to France. So they're suspicious that she might have some ulterior motives. Some of her allies are French aligned. And now, at this point, this hasn't become a big problem yet, but it's going to. She is a little bit like this is the beginning of that era. Like Margaret d'Anjou, Margaret, either way. Yeah, she's taking advantage, not necessarily taking advantage, but filling in what was necessary. The king's not making decisions. So this is half usurpation, half someone's got to do the job, right? It's just common sense. You can't just have a king that just doesn't at one point the archbishop died. The archbishop is appointed by the king. It's just like, who do you want to be king? Who do you want to be archbishop, king? And he just doesn't say anything. And they just keep asking him, like, what about this guy? No response. What about this guy? No response. Like all the different ways they tried to get answers out of him, he just said nothing. So it's just crazy just to think about that. Like imagine a king that just says nothing for months and months and months. It's so weird. And so this is a lot like King Aenys, a little bit like Viserys, because the long term of this, things just gradually got worse and worse, and no one did anything about it. And you could tell this was going to break into a civil war eventually. Like just all that lead up to the Dance of the Dragons was kind of predictable. You're like, this is going to turn into a civil war, isn't it? Yup. This was similar, but it didn't have... this is more like Aenys in a lot of ways, because Aenys' inactivity caused a lot of wars to break out and the collapse of central authority. That didn't happen as much under Viserys. The wars under Viserys really happened after he died, not so much during. So this, one of the things that makes this so bad is blood feuds between nobility are one of the biggest problems in the ancient world, the medieval world, both. Because they just bring everybody in and they end up lasting for generations. This is something that the nobility tried pretty hard to do away with, but it could never do. This loss of central authority brought that back so fast. So many houses that were mad at each other, had old feuds, fired them up again because they knew the king couldn't stop them. They knew they had a window of opportunity to unleash their grievances. And what happens when that happens? The grievances just get worse and get newer, and the new generation gets freshly involved in them.
Yeah, new grievances are sort of created here too. I don't want to jump too far ahead to get too into it, but in the first battle, which was the first battle of St. Albans.
Well, hang on. Let's not get to, we're not to that yet. Let's not to St. Albans yet, but you're right. We should talk about that.
Yeah, I won't get into details, but they just, at the end of the battle, they killed the leaders, or a couple of leaders on the other side. Yeah. But then that was it. But at a later battle, they killed the leaders on the other side and their family.
It escalated.
Now the grievance is more personal, and never mind the king in a civil war. They want revenge on the people who killed their families.
Yeah, you're right. So what happened is these instability results in a lot of things, one of which is a rebellion under a guy named Jack Cade. Jack Cade called himself John Mortimer. Mortimer is a very powerful house that was a bigger player during the 100 Years' War and prior to that. There's still Mortimers today. You go to Wikipedia and look up House Mortimer, there's like 20 living Mortimers that descend from House Mortimer back in the day. Like there's athletes and people, MPs and all sorts of people. Just lots of Mortimers out there. This reminds me of the Golden Company, where the Golden Company, a lot of the exiles just call themselves famous Westerosi houses, even though they have no connection to them at all. Some of these houses have been extinct for centuries, and it's like, yeah, I'm House Mud. Like, no, you're not. You're going to tell me I'm not? I'll fight you. Like, okay, you're House Mud. That's the attitude, and this is what this guy is kind of doing here. He's like, yeah, my name's not Mortimer, but I'm calling myself that, and I dare you to say otherwise. So, very Golden Company-like. His rebellion was surprisingly successful. He got inside London with his army. London was the capital then. The king lived there, sort of. Like, the capital's there. The king has like a manor outside of town or whatever, at other estates. But that's still like where the capital is. He cut the ropes to London Bridge so that the other people couldn't come inside, so he could try to hold the city from within. And he was eventually defeated. They did get him. But he did shockingly well, and it was just like, whoa, it really sent the message to everyone just how unstable England was. Like this rebel leader leading peasants, almost entirely peasants, like he was a noble, but a lower rank noble, got this far. It was really kind of unthinkable. This is when Richard, 3rd Duke of York, enters the picture. He had been around. He had done a lot. He had been a powerful politician, but he had been sent to Ireland in part because they didn't want him around because he was so powerful. They were like, well, if he's in Ireland, he can't use the political inroads. If he's away from the capital, it's harder for him to advance and make alliances and move up the ladder of chaos a la Littlefinger.
He reminds me a little bit sometimes of Tywin, sometimes of Daemon.
Yeah, he has that element. I totally agree, but we're calling him Richard Rickard because I think best of all, he's a Rickard Stark parallel, meaning a guy who's really important in the recent story before A Song of Ice and Fire, whose death in particular kicked off a lot of things and set the stage for the most important phase of the war. So Richard, 3rd Duke of York, again, we're calling him Richard Rickard from now on. He is brought in to help get things running smoothly again. Enough people had called for him because of the instability that he was brought back. He's the richest man in England besides the king at this point, too.
The default guy was this Edmund, but people were shaky on him.
Yeah, because he lost France.
Foundered in France. And Margaret was kind of taking some power, and they didn't like the idea of a woman being in charge. So, this guy's got the best claim. He's wealthy. Let's get him in here.
Yeah, so Margaret objected to this. She's like, no, I don't want this guy coming. But she lost out on that decision, and this is kind of like how Cersei didn't want Ned to be hanged. This is very similar to that. Instead of Ned's son, we have Ned's father in this role.
So here's a moment I feel it's good to clarify. Margaret, this Edmund character, they're the Yorks.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, they're the Lancasters. Yeah, Margaret, Edmund, with Henry VI at the top. They're the top members of the Lancastrian faction at this moment.
This Richard Rickard, he's the York.
He's the York.
He's the York coming.
Absolutely. So he's considered by many, like you said, Sean, to be the heir to Henry because Henry and Margaret don't yet have a child. That's coming very soon, though. So lots of other factors in play. Richard Rickard also has a big family. He has Robert Edward, because Edward's like Robert. He has Edmund Brandon, because Edmund is like Brandon Stark. Not Bran, but Ned's older brother. We have George Renly, because George is like Renly. And we have Richard Stannis. Richard is going to be Richard III eventually, and he's a lot like Stannis. He also had 3 daughters. Anne, who's kind of like the original Sansa, meaning the Sansa that George designed in the original 13 chapters before he modified her character and evolved her. Then we have Elizabeth, who I call Elizabeth 11, because she had 11 children. And then we have a Margaret, who kind of stands on her own. Maybe she's a bit of a Marjorie, but we'll talk about her separately later on. So Richard Rickard was actually pretty good in this role. He wasn't overly biased. He was pretty fair. And one thing he was set to do was to adjudicate a northern civil war. Imagine the Starks versus the Boltons, or maybe the Boltons versus the Manderleys while the Starks are out of the picture. And it's under the laxity of Henry VI, this northern conflict between House Percy and House Neville is threatening to become a full-blown northern civil war like what we have in A Dance with Dragons, like an actual major war happening in the north. So,
and just to make things confusing, the head of this Neville family's name is Richard, right?
Yeah, right, yes. And so is his son's name, Richard. So both of these Richards have sons named Richard. And they both have sons named Edward, I think, too. Anyway, so he wasn't popular either. Like, he wasn't, like, none of these characters were liked by the populace. Some were liked more than others, but they always had, like, they all had detractors and supporters. You know, people who liked them a lot, people who hated them a lot. Richard Rickard was not like Ned in that he was very proud. He's more like Tywin in that he was very proud. He took slights and insults. He was very prickly. And he ruffled some feathers a bit. He tried to adjudicate against the Percys and Nevilles, and that went pretty well. He even imprisoned his own son-in-law, Henry Holland, who is kind of like a Randall Tarley, a very violent but effective leader if he's in combat. And that's all he wanted to be. He's like, well, this guy's a duke. He could do all these things if he wanted to. He could be a church guy. He could be a landowner. He could expand. He could do, but all he really wanted to do was be involved in wars. So this guy was very violent. He was part of the reason this war was threatening to become a full-blown civil war. So he imprisoned this Henry Holland guy, which wasn't popular with some people, but it was maybe necessary. So politically speaking, he was doing a lot of the right things, but there was still too much angst over supremacy that he was pushing against the Beauforts for their failure, especially Edmund for losing. He went so far as to call Beaufort a traitor. He's like, this was treasonous. His actions there were so poorly designed, so ill-considered that it should be considered treason, not just bad leadership. So that's pretty political. That's going a little far. So this is the one thing that he maybe slipped up on, that he was a little personal with his office. But other than that, he was fairly kind of fair. So anyway, this is kind of like the example of Ned arguing for Tywin's arrest, when that maybe was under the law correct, but the actual reality is that Tywin's just going to call his banners and go to war.
You got to read the room. What's really going to happen here, you know?
Yes, perfect example. So, and meanwhile, while York is in his short stint here, because it's going to be fairly short, and he is referred to as King's Hand in some of the histories here. So that's kind of a parallel as well. This is when Sean mentioned earlier, Margaret gives birth to a son, and of course it's freaking Edward. This is our Edward Joffrey. This boy is going to talk a lot about cutting off heads as a 10-year-old. He can't wait to chop off heads. So he's a little bit Joffrey-like. But at this point, he's just a baby. So he snaps out of it. Henry does. And this was said by many historians that his catatonic state was a disaster. Him coming out of it was worse.
It was a national tragedy.
Yeah, it's a national tragedy.
Yeah.
One of the first things he starts doing is think of Aerys and Tywin, where Tywin, they weren't necessarily the most moral decisions, but they were decisions that led to stability. And Aerys, just because he didn't want Tywin to get credit, would reverse these. That's not necessarily what was happening here. They weren't just reversing them because they were working and he didn't want Richard Rickard to get credit, but it was similar. A lot of things he did were reversed. For example, Beaufort no longer declared a traitor. He's like, no, that's not treason. It doesn't rise to treason. We're just going to give him a slap on the wrist and this other stuff. So that was reversed. That's embarrassing for Rickard.
And he ends up sending Richard back to Ireland.
Sends him back.
Beaufort back in this hand of the kingish sort of position.
Yeah. So stripped him as his role as Lord Protector. And that was kind of seen as Margaret's decision, whether true or not. And it probably was, because Henry just didn't do very much on his own. Like, it may have been other counselors advising this too, but basically this is a true, who can get control of the puppet. This is a very true, he who controls the king controls the kingdom situation. And it's going to continue through a lot of this story. A lot of people, again, Richard wasn't all that well liked, Richard Rickard. Not all that well liked, but neither was Margaret, because a lot of generic misogyny. There's always that. But she wasn't English at all. She's completely French. So there's also this whole, we're being ruled by a foreigner kind of factor, which I think even modern people can kind of be like, that's not great. If we have a person who's never, who wants somebody that didn't grow up in their country and has only lived there a couple of years to be in charge of everything? That's not racist. that's just...
It's understandable, at least.
Yeah, that person doesn't know the culture very well. That person has valuable things to say, but to be number one in charge of the country, that's sketchy. So people didn't like that so much. So it was damned if you do, damned if you don't, because they don't really love either of these factions. Now, maybe on Richard's underhanded play, maybe it just developed on its own, a rumor starts coming out that, hey, how can this Prince Edward Joffrey be Henry's? He was catatonic for 15 months. How he's having sex? How it doesn't really add up, does it? So, but honestly, that's not a problem. She was pregnant before the breakdown happened. The timeline is not an issue here, but that's what we know. The commoners, the other lords around where the timeline's a lot less certain, the rumor worked. At least it got it in the door. It caused some lack of certainty. It definitely undermined the birth of this prince. So Margaret just kept pushing, though. She was like, no, we got to keep going. Eventually, she gets Richard out, and she keeps pushing, keeps removing more and more of his power, taking more and more away. And he's like, okay, this is going too far. This is no longer a balance thing. If we allow this to continue, we're going to actually lose a lot of power for good. So he was in a position where it's like the Ned and Tywin thing, where it's either you come face justice and probably get thrown in jail, or you get behind your army and see what happens then. And that is what happened. Richard's like, all right, I either have to lose a lot of power or rebel. He chose to rebel, but he was very political about it. He's like, I'm not rebelling against the king. I'm rebelling against the king's counselors. I'm rebelling against Margaret and Beaufort and these other ones, not the king. So that was an interesting argument to put out, and it kind of worked. Kinda. So in 1455, the war breaks out. This is a 32-year conflict. It's considered to have really begun then. Richard's summoned to a great council to account for his actions, and he suspects it's a trap. He's been warned that there's an army waiting for him. The Lancasters bring 2,000 men. So he brings a lot more. It's not certain how many, at least 3,000, maybe as many as 7,000. They hear he's coming with this army, and they send messages like, disperse your army, bring 200 men, and then each of you other guys can bring 160. And they're like, no, we're bringing our whole army. And this gets to that thing Sean referenced earlier, the first Battle of St. Albans. They're like, don't fight us, and we're like, well, you don't fight me, and you don't fight me, we don't fight you, and then violence breaks out. There's a lot of people here, but somehow, right? Isn't this funny? Only a few people die, right, Sean?
Yeah, it was a kind of a cool moment, I think. They're converged around this town, and thousands of troops. And Richard Rickard's nephew, whose name, of course, is also Richard, and he gets the nickname Kingmaker down the road. And so that maybe we can compare him to Kristen Cole in certain ways. That might be a good way to keep track of which Richard this is. But they're sort of negotiating in his town. They're sending messengers back and forth, and no one really expects there to be an actual fight, an actual violence to break out. They just think there's going to be some negotiation. Someone's going to give up lands or agree to get exiled or something. But this nephew, Richard's like, screw it, I'm attacking. And he just takes these troops, charges through the streets, and comes upon a congregation of soldiers and lords who just they don't have their helmets on. They're just drinking and hanging out, and just attacks and kills less than 100 people get killed in this little skirmish. But included are Edmund Beaufort. And they capture the king. They capture Henry VI was there too, and they capture him.
Yeah, they brought him. It's really interesting. They brought him there to work against Richard's argument. They're like, how can you claim to be against the king's counselors when the king is in this army? If you attack this army that's led by the king, you are attacking the king, aren't you? So they're trying to like pull a fast one on his argument, and it sort of worked, but sort of didn't. But Sean is right. The really important death there is this Edmund Beaufort, who had been such an important part of all this. Also killed is Henry Percy, and who was in charge of the
Neville.
Northern Civil War guy, right? So that was a big deal. And this other Lord, Thomas Clifford, who his importance comes a little later, but powerful Lord for sure. So
one sort of fortunate thing that comes from this is that it easily could have been hundreds or thousands of people getting killed, but instead it's just dozens.
Yeah.
But man, what a coup. This is such a shock to the kingdom, right?
Yeah.
The king has been captured. Beaufort has been killed. So it kind of really starts the career of this Richard Kingmaker character. And now Richard
Rickard.
Lancaster, Richard Rickard, he's really got all the cards now.
Yeah, the York, you mean. Yeah, the York. He's got all the cards. It's easy to get the murder. So he kind of is back as Lord Protector. He's kind of like forcibly installed as King's Hand again. Except this time, Henry is at least lucid. He's still weak, but he's talking and giving orders and responsive. So there's 4 years of peace in England, roughly. But their proxy wars continued. There was allies fighting in France and in Spain and at sea. Especially this Warwick Kingmaker guy who led this sort of started the violence at St. Albans here, grew very powerful. Grew more powerful than his own father. So we have Richard, son of Richard, getting more powerful than Father Richard.
This Richard of Warwick, the one that initiated the charge, becomes more powerful than his father. It's interesting because as a child, kind of like King Henry VI, as a child, he doesn't know what's going on. He's just a kid, but all around him, different events keep making him more and more powerful. Different marriages within his family and people dying and leaving their inheritances. Suddenly, he's got all his father's stuff and all the possessions of the family on his mother's side and people that married into it, and they had a kid, but that kid died, so it went to him. And suddenly, he's like as he said, more powerful than the elder Richard as a child. But then also proves himself before this Battle of St. Albans. He was knighted at age 17, by the way. He'd already proved himself.
I missed that detail. That's cool. Yeah. So this is a really important guy. He's a great fighter. That's why he's Warwick. That's why we call him Warwick Kingmaker. Even though he doesn't need a Song of Ice and Fire nickname, because Kingmaker is his name in this story. That's his actual real name. Now, he is, again, like Sean said, a bit of Kristen Cole because of his fighting ability, but also a bit like a Tywin because of his just huge amount of power that he wields a little already now, but it continues to grow throughout this story. So, meanwhile, Henry is just trying very ineffectual things to get them to get along. This is very like Viserys, where Viserys, we saw this in House of the Dragon. It's in the books too, but it might be more memorable on the TV screen where he's just like, don't do that. Everybody get along.
I love you. You love me. Love each other.
Yeah.
Just love each other. And that's it. That's all you have to do.
Yeah, that's all you got to do is just tell them, make them shake hands. And yeah, right? That's all you got to do. Of course, that's not all you have to do. So,
because Henry has Love Day, right?
It's a love day.
Celebration in the streets where basically he just wants everyone to be friends.
He made everyone like hold hands and walk through the streets. And of course, that was about as effective as you could imagine, which is not at all. It was just very silly. But this really happened. Yeah, this shows this guy's where he was at. Henry wouldn't curse. The strongest curse he would use is forsooth. He would say like forsooth and forsooth. He would double it. That's as far as he would go. Like 2 forsooths, let alone. He wouldn't go 3 or 4 forsooths. 4 forsooths is too many. So next thing we have is the next major milestone we have here is what was called the Act of accord. And so Richard Rickard and Warwick Richard and Warwick Richard's father are all summoned to court to account for their proxy wars, especially Warwick Richard, who had started a naval battle without permission, and, better to ask for forgiveness than ask for permission. And it worked for him because what he did was very popular. He did an illegal military thing that really benefited England. And so it was like, don't punish him. We're all getting rich because of this guy. He helped our merchant situation. He cut one nation out of the merchant business. And so England's merchants all benefited greatly from it. Anyway, so the king, probably thanks to Margaret and some other counselors, are like, all you Richards, you triple Richards, come to court and answer for your actions. And they knew they were going to get arrested. Not only was it the writing on the wall, but something similar had happened 10 years before. A different duke was called to account. He went to London and was never seen again. He was locked in the Tower of London, and that was it. They left him there. So they're like, we're not doing that. We're not going to leave our big ass armies and our giant coffers of gold to put ourselves at the mercy of this guy ruled by this woman who hates us. we're just not doing that. So instead, they basically just go to their armies and prepare to fight. They're like, yeah, we're gonna fight. So the York armies, they have to scatter to their individual lands. Think the beginning of Robert's Rebellion, when Ned and Robert and the rest all scatter to go back to their homes from the Vale to fire up their own troops. And all along the time, the enemies, the loyalists, are trying to stop them from reaching those destinations. They don't want Robert to get back to the Stormlands. They don't want Ned to get back to the north, because if they do, they get to rally their troops. If you stop them from doing that, the war's a lot shorter. But as we know, they didn't. Same thing happened here. The Lancasters tried to stop the Yorkist elements from combining into one force, but they failed. A little more, also kind of reminiscent of the Battle of the Bells, where the Robert's allies were racing to meet there, and Tywin got there first, or could have gotten there first, and John Connington failed to burn the city, which Tywin would have done, according to Miles Toyne. So
careful the phrasing there.
Yeah,
failing to burn a city isn't cowardice.
Right? Yes, good quote from Alicent there. Yeah, I like that. So the Yorkists were, So we have. Anyway, finally, there's an event where the Kingmaker steals some Lancastrian ships that are being built, which is kind of a neat maneuver, kind of similar to maybe Orain Waters making off with those Dromans that Cersei had built. So they combined their armies. They didn't combine their armies. They did it in Ireland. So it's like, well, the Lancasters will have a hard time stopping us if we join up over here. So then they landed in the West and made their way over. And in 1460, 5 years after the Wars of the Roses considered to have started, the first ever artillery battle in England happens. There was cannons before, but they didn't have artillery. The difference is you're shooting up and down. The difference isn't really that important to get into, but anyway, cannons had been used on the mainland since the beginning of the war, 100 Years' War. There were cannons in Joan of Arc's wars and all of that. But they hadn't made their way over to England just yet. So Kingmaker, again, shows his worth. Instead of, A, he's a great fighter, B, he's a great understander of politics, amasser of power and wealth here, and stealing of ships, so just commando moves. Here he uses bribery. There's a army that shows up to fight them, and the Lancastrian army they're kind of facing down each other, and the Kingmaker manages to bribe the leader of the Lancastrian left to just let them through. Just drop your arms. We'll just walk right through your army and attack. No
one will die and you'll be rich.
Yeah, which is exactly what happened. Some people did die, but none of his men died.
Yeah.
And the agreement it wasn't just give me money. It was, hey, if I lay down my arms, will you rule in my favor in this property dispute with one of the Beauforts or definitely one of the Lancastrians? And they're like, well, why, yes. Once we take the government, we will rule in your favor in this property dispute. You will get this large earldom, and Thank you. And that's the deal. And he's somehow, and suspiciously, he also becomes Lord Treasurer 3 years later. So it's like, yeah, this guy got some good concessions out of this arrangement. So they win. They defeat the Lancastrian elements. They capture Henry again. And they say, hey, look, remember Richard Rickard is like, yo, I was just at war with the counselors. So they go to London and they're all going through the ceremony of saying, okay, we're at peace again. And Richard Rickard symbolically puts his hand on the throne. Everyone knows what this means. It means I'm claiming this.
Yeah.
Everybody, even his own allies didn't see this coming. He was like, no, because he had gotten a lot of their support by saying he was only going after the counselors, not the king. But once he's inside, he's like, hand on the throne. And a bunch of people are like, whoa, hold up. We weren't on board for that. And the Lancastrians, of course, freak out. Yeah, you've gone too far. Yes, that is definitely what happened. So Parliament and the powerful lords sort of like, what do we do? What do we do? We got to figure this out. And what they finally agree to is Henry's still king. Henry VI, as weak as he is, he's anointed by God. They're very stuck in their ways on that whole thing, and they want stability. That's still very important to them. And you'll see why. Stability is important, because when they lose it later, it's really hard to regain. So you understand why they really cling to this, despite it seeming like hopeless almost. So what happens is they agree to disinherit young Edward Joffrey, who's still just a little baby at this point, and make Richard Rickard explicitly Henry's heir. So he's definitely next. He had a strong claim, so this isn't too crazy, but disinheriting young Edward Joffrey is a little crazy. And
it's unprecedented, really, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Basically, the compromise is Richard Rickard is saying, okay, Henry VI is still king, but I'm next in line. Not his son, not anyone else, which was the case before the son was born. He was actually next in line, but he's saying, let's go back to that.
And make it official. It was kind of like assumed, because it was like, well, if you look at the claims, this guy's next. So they made it official. This is called the Act of Accord. Now, there were similar treaties. Nina points out there were some similar ones negotiated by Henry VI's father, Henry V. Henry V, by the way, completely the opposite kind of guy. Warlike, everybody, they loved him. They were like, oh, this is exactly the kind of king we want. They wanted another one like him, basically. And
by the way, they are all stupid. I wish everyone was like Henry VI and everyone loved Henry VI.
One person who definitely did not accept the Act of Accord, disinheriting young Edward Joffrey, was his mother, Margaret Cersei. Margaret Cersei's like, no, we're not doing this. They thought they could push her aside, but this is no ordinary late Middle Ages woman. She was powerful, aggressive, and determined, and ambitious.
And worried about her son's life.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Because, again, from context of all the stories of Martin, you kind of know this boy's life is not safe anymore, because sure, they made this accord kind of under duress, but what happens a few years down the road when Henry's dead and Richard Rickard is in charge, or if this boy grows up and so if the boy or someone via the boy wants to angle for power themselves, this boy's life is in danger.
This is Otto Hightower telling Alicent that if you let Rhaenyra take the throne, they're going to kill all your children. That's what's happening here, except it's probably more true. It might have been true in the House of the Dragon, Dance of the Dragon scenario. It's definitely true here. So Margaret has
maybe wouldn't have killed him, but they certainly would have just left him in jail.
Yeah, they would have done something. Yeah, he would not have had like a life. Yeah, not what a mother wants for her son. It's very clearly like the wrong outcome from her perspective, and it's not just a loss of political power. It puts his life in danger, as you say. So yeah, so now things get a little worse. War breaks out again. Margaret raises an army, and we've got things happening. Wars all over the country.
She just says, I don't like this. She says, I don't like this, and I'm going to stop it one way or the other. Right?
She basically goes to Scotland, gets an army there, and she starts telling people she's having trouble recruiting. The Scots normally are not hard to recruit to fight the English, especially in this era, right?
That's why she went there.
Right. That's part of why she went there. And King James of Scotland was like, we're all about people who don't like England. So if you got a grudge with England, come here. We might be able to work together. So she goes up there. And so she's not having a great time recruiting troops. They're coming. And she's getting support from the mainland France as well, because she's still got a lot of connections there. But what she starts to do to get even more troops is she's like, if you join me, we're going to pillage cities and you can have lots of plunder. So this, of course, doesn't go over very well with the English. Like, we told you this woman was bad news. Look what she's doing. She's just like agreeing to sack the country. She's recruiting troops by promise of horrifying deeds here. So lots of back and forth here. There's war. We don't need to go through a lot of these smaller battles, but war's all over the country now. At one point, Rickard is in one of his castles, and there's a Lancastrian force nearby that's much bigger than his. He's with his son Edmund, the second son. Edmund is like Brandon Stark, Ned's older brother, mostly only because he's going to die alongside his father, which is what happens in A Song of Ice and Fire, right? Other than that, his personality isn't that similar. But for some reason, Rickard emerges from his safety of his castle to attack this army that's much bigger than his. It's very weird. It's debated to this day why it happened. And this is a reminder. We say this period of history is very well detailed. We know so many things about it, but you never know what's in someone's head. No period of history is that detailed that we can have insight into what were they thinking, right?
And sometimes maybe you don't exactly know what they knew. Like, that's one of the theories, is he didn't realize how much bigger the other army was, or maybe they used some kind of trick, like they held some forces back in a forest and came forward into a field. And so he thought it was, I don't remember the exact numbers, but I think he had something like 5,000 troops and they had something like 8,000. But maybe he was led to believe they also have 5,000. But even in that scenario, it seems like you just stay in a castle. You're still 5,000 troops in a castle. You're never going to beat them. With 10,000 troops, you probably won't beat them. It reminds me of Argilac the Arrogant. Like, he's like, screw it. I'm just going to go fight. I'm going to go down swinging,
Yep.
Like,
it is like that. And Richard did have this reputation for being a little bit rash, which is part of where the Brandon Stark element comes in here too.
And the seizing of the throne.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And just moving quickly and maybe without fully thinking things through. So
one other quick, maybe this doesn't even matter, but he had called for reinforcements.
That's another possibility.
Yeah, he didn't even wait. He didn't even wait. He just attacked anyway.
Maybe he thought they were closer than they were. Again, it's a historical mystery. We don't know what this guy was doing. It may have been arrogance. He may have been tricked. May have been a little of both. We don't know. Either way, he's killed in this battle. Rickard dead, and his son Edmund also killed. Also killed his Kingmaker's father, Richard. So we lose 2 of the 3 Richards here. There's more Richards to come. Don't worry, folks. The Richards will regenerate. They repop. They always repop. So, but 2 of the 3 Richards that are the leading Richards at this point, who are all Yorks, are killed. So, and the Edmund is killed. So that puts Robert Baratheon Edward, in charge of the Yorkist faction, in terms of, not necessarily in charge, but he's the leading claimant now. He's the eldest son. So he's the top guy. But he's only 18, kind of like Robert was about 20 years old during Robert's Rebellion. This guy's only about 18, but he's 6'4", a great personality. Men love to follow him in battle. So much in common with Robert. So he's about to emerge as a big player on the scene now. So the Lancastrians actually recapture Henry. They recapture the king. This king changes hands more often than, I don't know, something that changes hands often.
Throughout the course of it, he was, if I remember correctly, he was captured and imprisoned, released, captured and imprisoned, released, captured and imprisoned.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And one of those times, he was just out in the world. He was just like in the woods, going house to house just to try to avoid being captured. It's crazy to me what this guy went through.
Yeah, there's different. One of the times he was captured, he was just sitting under a tree singing. And singing to himself while the battle raged around him. And it's like, this is pretty well attested to. Like, this guy had some mental problems. Yeah, this is where
he kept being present at the battles, so maybe get some credit. Yeah. I don't know how much of it he was choosing or forced to go. But man, what a movie about his life would be. Yeah, I don't know if you can make it a movie.
I think there has
TV
been.
Series.
Yeah. So Warwick Kingmaker is now head of the Neville faction, as well as Edward being head of the York faction, the full York faction. So these are like the change at the top. Both of the 2 leaders of the house and their number 1 ally, the Yorks and the Nevilles, have a switch at the top. because of one battle. Both leaders died in one battle, so that's very unlikely. So Warwick also lost a different battle to Margaret and Edward Joffrey, because enough time is Edward Joffrey is young enough. He's at these battles, even though he's very young. So although Margaret wanted to keep him safe, there was reasons to have him present, and sometimes she did keep him away from the battlefield. And later, that will prove decisive when she doesn't. But that's about a decade from now. So even though Warwick is defeated by Margaret at one point, she's still able to link up their armies. Now Margaret gets all the way to London with her army, but because of her policy of allowing pillage, London's like, nope, you can't come in. This is King's Landing. This is Tywin walking up to the gates of King's Landing, and Varys saying, don't let him in. He's going to sack the city. This is very similar. But they didn't listen to Varys. In this case, they did listen to the Varys, whoever that is. Basically, the whole populace was like, no. It wasn't just one guy. It was like, no way. You can't come in here with your army of Scots that doesn't like us and your other guys who we can't trust. So she has to leave. She has to take her army elsewhere because, they have to eat and try to take other targets. So when she leaves, the York and Neville faction shows up with Warwick Kingmaker and Edward, and London does let them in. They're like, you guys were cool with. You don't have this reputation for burning cities, so come right on in. And again, Robert Edward is Robert Edward. I compare him to Robert for a reason. People like him. He is charismatic. He is charming. They're like, look at that guy. Maybe he's the answer to all these problems. He's certainly the opposite of Henry VI. He's tall and warlike and charming and decisive.
Margaret might have made it worse with some of her plundering precedent,
yes.
But still, they're going to pick the English warrior man over the French woman,
yes.
Right?
Yeah, no doubt. Yeah, so there was a lot of reasons to prefer him, even maybe without the pillaging. But the pillaging was just, it didn't matter who she was. She could have been also a powerful war leader man. They wouldn't have liked that regardless, I don't think.
Yeah.
So let's see here. So next we have the crowning of Edward. Edward IV. Robert Baratheon / Edward IV establishes the Royal House of York. This is the year 1461, 6 years after hostilities begin. Again, very popular guy, but the throne is not secure. Yeah, he got London, but we already told you Margaret's army was still out there. She had allies in the field. Henry VI is still alive, right? So they had strong armies in the field. It wasn't just Margaret, like I said. So he immediately takes his army out into the field. He's doing stuff, small battles, smaller battles. Then there's a major battle, Mortimer's Cross. This one's really cool. Right before the battle at dawn, the sun goes into parhelion. That's when it looks like there's three suns. It's a weird atmospheric effect of trick of the light, blah, blah, blah. We don't need to understand the science. The people in this time surely didn't. And they were like, oh, God, that's an omen. But Robert Edward, being a great war leader, spins it like the red comet. He's like, that's our comet. That's for us. That's the Holy Trinity rising to fight. God's on our side. And they're like, yeah, God's on our side. All right. Again, this guy, very good at leading troops. Hugely important at inspiring his men.
That reminds me of the moment in House of the Dragon when Aegon showed up in his dragon. And Kristen Cole's like, what the heck? He's not supposed to be here. Our king is here to lead us. Like, he knows it's bad, but he's got to say something positive to the troops.
You're right. That's a great comparison. I love that. So the troops are happy, and then he wins this battle, and he takes the sun and this triple sun as his badge. It's called the Sun in Splendor, which is a phrase that pops up a lot. That's the name of the Sharon K. Penman book that brought me into all this long ago, the one that George just absolutely loves, and we'll hopefully get a chance to talk about at the end of this. A key death in this battle was Owen Tudor. Owen Tudor married Henry VI's mother. Henry VI's mother remarried after she had Henry VI and her kingly husband died. This was Catherine of Valois. Remember, the Valois was half of the struggle in the 100 Years' War. So they're a very powerful royal French house with a storied history. Owen Tudor marries Catherine of Valois in secret. And they have 3 kids, Edmund, Jasper, and, of course, Edward Tudor. Thankfully, this Edward Tudor, we don't have to mention again. He dies young, and we can forget about him.
Worth noting, spoilers, the Tudors end up being the next dynasty of England.
Hugely important. The TV show The Tudors, picks up a little later at like, these are the immediate ancestors of the characters that appear in that Tudor show. Not long after the Battle of Mortimer's Cross was the Battle of Towton. The Battle of Towton was the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. And it had all sorts of other strange things going on. Over 50,000 soldiers. It was on Palm Sunday, so like a religious holiday, and it was a snowstorm. Whoa, right? So that, like, this is all the things that you can imagine. Like, George is just like, wow, how can I use this? this is awesome, you know? A guy named Lord Clifford. Remember we had a Clifford killed before. A different Lord Clifford, the day before the battle, stops at a bridge to take a drink with his horse, lifts his helmet off, takes an arrow in the throat. Just like Fireball before the Battle of Redgrass Field. Right? That's pretty obvious inspiration there. Just like Fireball, it was the day before the battle. And just right when he lifts his... this is a carbon copy. George usually changes things. This one he didn't. He's like, that's cool as is. We'll just use that. This battle also had a lot of drownings. People were, once the battle turned into a rout, once one side started running away, that's when more casualties happen. And a lot of them were trying to cross this kind of narrow river at a spot. Well, the narrow spot where you can cross it, I should say, the ford. And a lot of allies are trampling each other and drowning. And it's like the fish feed or the Battle of the Trident, where once it got bad, it got real bad. And it was also called the Bloody Meadow, which is strange because there's another battle that gets called the Bloody Meadow. So there's this, which again reminds us of the Redgrass Field. Hello, Redgrass Field, Bloody Meadow. Yep. George's name is cooler, though. I like Redgrass Field even more. But you can see the obvious influence there, I think. One key death is the Earl of Ormond. And I only mention that because Ormond. There's like an Ormond Baratheon and an Ormond Lannister. That's just a name George likes. So, anyway. Margaret and Edward Joffrey escape with Henry VI back to Scotland. Back to King James, like, all right, we lost, but we're not done. In fact, they're back in about 3 years. And they have some initial successes. But then Edward, being such a great battle leader, just takes the field, and the Yorkists win again. And Henry VI is again recaptured, and another Edmund Beaufort is killed.
It's like deja vu.
Yeah. This is like the most like, wait, did I already write this down? Didn't I already cover this part? Yeah. Like, nope, it just happened again. So Edward Robert has secured his throne. This is a good little break point for us. We'll continue the story from here. But and it's going to start with Edward Robert making a very familiar mistake that you all know quite well from A Song of Ice and Fire. One that's going to make you sad, perhaps, because it's a sad thing that happened. But before we get to that, let's talk about routines. I am not a man that is good at keeping routines. I am an undisciplined personality, have been for most of my life. I probably have ADHD. I haven't been diagnosed with it, but I have a real hard time focusing. And as I get older, routines really help me get better at that. And one of the things that works for me is doing simple routines, something really easy that doesn't require a lot of effort. A habit I have is coffee, but a routine I now have is drinking Magic Mind because it's easy, it's simple, it's pretty cheap, and it's helping me cut back on coffee. And it's a little daily ritual that helps me establish bigger patterns in my life. Keeping track of this, keeping consistent with something helps me build consistency in bigger things elsewhere in my life. I've been preaching Magic Mind for a while, talking about how it's helped me cut back on coffee, and I think I can prove that a little bit by showing you this mug. Not because it's a Star Wars mug, but because most of you who have been following me for a long time know that I used to always have a big thermos of coffee. I would have it like every single week. If you've kept up, I haven't had one of those like in months. I've maybe had it once or twice over the past year. I definitely credit both the routine and Magic Mind, which is part of the routine and part of the chemical solution for that. So I really can't say enough about how much Magic Mind has affected my life. And they've got an even better deal for you now. Go to magicmind.com, use the code VIPHOW40 for 40% off. We've had specials before, but this I think is the biggest one yet. So it's a good time to take advantage of that. Once again, that's VIPHOW40, magicmind.com. I know Sean and Shay have been keeping up with their Magic Mind as well. All three of us.
Yeah, I mix it. It's Magic Mind is green, but I have the green machine Naked Drink also. It's packed full of nutrients, but the Magic Mind is what's not in here that used to be is Mountain Dew. My drink used to be like Red Bull, Mountain Dew, and whatever else. But now it's Naked Drink and Magic Mind. So
that's a really good change.
Sparkling ice gets in there, but
yeah, that's awesome. I love to hear that. I really appreciate George even more after sorting through all this. This was really hard stuff to get into our head, to get straight, to be able to talk to it like this. And it helps me understand that George is able to deliver a lot of this complexity without it being as dense or confusing. Like, yeah, sometimes Game of Thrones can be confusing, but it's not as confusing as this. He manages it better. He draws out the more interesting parts, the characters, the things that make it interesting. He's able to sort through all this, find the most interesting parts, highlight them, increase the conflict, increase the drama, maybe even while maintaining the realism. And just putting that all together, man, that must be really hard. So yeah, yay, George. I'm preaching to the choir, I know, but that's where we're at. Also, I want to recommend y'all check us out on Twitch, twitch.tv/History of Westeros. Currently playing a campaign in the time of the Hedge Knight. Well, we're about 40 years past that now, but we are playing House Corbray. It's pretty fun. My character lost an eye and replaced it with a ruby. So he's there was an option. It was like, do you want to replace your eye with a gemstone? It was like, yes. And there was like a big list of gemstones, and I did that. So that was really fun. Yes.
Did you have the option to replace it with a gemstone versus a patch? Or,
you default to an eye patch, and then you can switch it if you want. Yeah.
Okay.
And since it's Corbray, whose colors are black, white, and red, I wanted a gem so I could have taken obsidian, I could have taken diamond, or I could have taken the ruby. The ruby just looked cool. He had red hair too, so yeah, looked good. All right, so back to the events here. We have Edward Robert loses the Kingmaker. So we have a very powerful block that looks like they've won, but what's the one thing that can go wrong is, well, this powerful block splits asunder. And it happens for the weirdest reason, well, but again, one that you're familiar with in sort of tragic memory, I suppose. He pulls a Robb Stark. Warwick, Kingmaker, is in France where he's got a lot of pull, a lot of power, and he's trying to arrange a marriage to Edward IV to a French princess, a powerful ally. What could secure the throne better than that by reestablishing some of that prior connection to France?
Edward IV being Robert Edward's son, right?
No, this is Robert Edward. This is still Robert Edward.
Oh, he's trying to get a marriage for Robert Edward to a French princess.
Yes, Robert Edward took the throne unmarried, in part because it wouldn't make it look like any other house had hooks in him. He wouldn't have to, he wouldn't be overly, he wouldn't owe another house a lot. And so that way it would make sure no one thinks that other house is ruling through him. That's something we don't see in Game of Thrones as much, but makes sense when you hear it. 'Cause it's like, well, Robert did appear to have the Lannisters ruling through him quite a bit, didn't he? So you would want to make it, you don't want to make it seem like you owe the throne to anyone. You want to say, no, I took this, it's mine, I don't owe anyone for it, because then, that creates the image of compromised government, right? It's already compromised, but they don't need to make it look worse. So what happens is he's working on this. These arrangements are really important. Not only is this really important because this is a powerful ally, but because this dates back to the 100 Years' War. This is the big loss in the 100 Years' War was Burgundy. Burgundy flipped. Burgundy was on the side of England, and then they flipped back to France. So they're kind of trying to get them back again. They're trying to get Burgundy back on their side again, which they will eventually do, because Margaret York, who is another of Rickard's daughters, is going to become the Duchess of Burgundy and is going to be a very important ally to her brother her brother Edward IV here. So, but Edward throws all this off. Another secret marriage happens. He marries Elizabeth Woodville in secret. Why? Well, does she have political value? Not really. Was she an ally worth rewarding that had stood by him all? No, they were Lancastrians, in fact. What was the reason then? Probably because she was hot. There may have been other historians have given reasons, political reasons, maybe just like he didn't want to involve another big house. He didn't want to get embroiled with France, but it's probably just because she was hot.
Maybe she had really big kindness.
Maybe she. So he keeps it secret for 4 months or so. to try to like break it in slowly. We're not even entirely sure why he kept it secret. Meanwhile, while he's keeping it secret, Warwick is still trying to negotiate. He's negotiating unintentionally in bad faith because Edward's already married, right? So what can he do? He gets the rug pulled out from under him when he finds this out. It makes him look really bad. First of all, it makes him look weaker than he was. Everybody's like, oh, he's the number 2 guy in England. I was like, are you? They didn't even tell you he was getting married. Like, the king got married without telling you. Like, how important are you, really? Like, that doesn't make you look very important. And it's also just throws off the ability for them to really shore up the rule. Like, it's like, what are you doing, man? This is the Woodvilles? Who are they? Right? So, meanwhile, Edward is also not allowing his younger brother George, who we call George Renly, because George Renly is going to turn on them a little bit, try to jump the line like he does to Stannis. Warwick, Kingmaker, tries to marry his daughter to George. And Edward's like, nah, no, don't do that. I'm not going to let you do that. This is kind of like Aerys Tywin. It's like, Tywin's like, oh, I should get to marry my daughter to Rhaegar. And Aerys is like, no, you don't. It's like, but I did so much to help you get yeah, it doesn't matter. I'm not doing that. I don't marry my servants. It's not the whole servant angle. He's not like making him look bad. He just is afraid of this power block forming, I think, or maybe other reasons. Either way, he says no. Warwick is really mad about all these things. First of all, he tries to undo the Woodville marriage. He's like, that didn't happen. Let's say it didn't happen. Let's just annul it. He accuses Elizabeth and her mother of witchcraft. Like, well, maybe this will convince people. Witchcraft, y'all. It was witchcraft. Didn't work. Of course that didn't work. Maybe you would have thought that would work in medieval England, but no, it didn't work. So he just switches sides. He's like, screw it, I'm switching sides. It wasn't quite as simple as just switching sides, but he's going to be brought into it. Here's how it happens. First of all, he just says, I don't care that you said we can't do this marriage. He marries his daughter, Isabel, to George Renly. Also in secret. So it's all these secret marriages. How are all these kings and queens getting married in secret? Well, it just keeps happening. And this gives us another Aegon the Elder, Aegon the Younger situation from The Dance of the Dragons. Edward the eldest son and heir, is Edward. Henry VI, one son and heir, is Edward. So we have Edward, the future Edward V, and we have Edward Joffrey, who's Henry VI. So there's other things that Warwick, Kingmaker, wants, other positions and marriages that he tries for, and he keeps getting denied. It's more Aerys and Tywin. It's just like Aerys is like surprisingly unwilling to reward this man's service. So go ahead, Sean.
And I want to interject a couple things. It is a little understandable because this guy is already in some ways more powerful than a king. He's the second wealthiest person in England. He owns all these lands and titles, and all these different things he's angling for are just adding to it even more. And now you would think that maybe the king trusts him or they're friends. They've worked together. They owe each other. But again, it's hard. This is the type of thing George does. He writes the personalities behind all these benchmark moments in history. So it's fun to imagine the other things at play here, but from at least a big picture sense, I can see why he would deny him this stuff. Like, you're already too powerful. I saw what the older Richard did to the old king. You know what I mean? Like, I don't want that to happen to me. We got to limit this somehow. It's said. Also worth noting that these secret marriages are so unusual because there's not like TV or internet or newspapers even. Like, people don't know these. You need witnesses. And we didn't talk about it earlier, but a lot of these people that got killed in battles, their bodies are put up on display. That's one reason for a head on a spike, is so everyone can see, yes, they're really dead. It's
easy to lie about one thing like that. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. They need evidence this person is dead so that the whatever other claim or whatever is being made is legitimate or believable or whatever. So
yeah,
these secret marriages are really unusual.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure Richard Rickard's head was displayed after he was killed at Wakefield. And maybe his son Edmund as well, Edmund Brandon. So yeah, now we mentioned before that technically England hadn't lost everything in France. They had a few little possessions left. One of them was the town of, or the city of Calais. Now what Warwick does is violence breaks out in the north again. The Northern Civil War.
Quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm going to say, it's that one city of Calais is really important. It's the largest standing army that England has. It's a really important key spot. Yeah,
it's something that the Yorks and Lancasters fought over several times, like who got that military appointment, because they knew that was whatever lord had the captaincy of Calais had that army. So Warwick had it for a while, and they got to switch it to someone else. Yeah, it was basically a revolving door based on which Rose faction was in charge. So the northern hostilities break out again, and Warwick's kingmaker says, all right, I'm going to call some troops up and take care of that. But what he actually does is call some troops up and then goes to Calais and get more troops and does the secret marriage plot with George Renly to his daughter Isabel. That's when he does that. Then he hooks up with France. Now, here's what happens there. Before they hook up with France fully, they plot to join these rebels instead of putting them down. The northern rebels are like, hey, why don't we join you instead of putting you down? And we can I can act like I'm going to go fight you, and then we can just like join up. So they do that. They join up together, and their plan is, or Warwick's plan, Kingmaker, is to put George Renly on the throne. It's very much like what happens in A Clash of Kings when Renly's like, actually, I can be king in front of both Joffrey and his siblings and Stannis. Why not? So Warwick is successful. They capture Robert Edward in the year 1469, and then they just let him go because it didn't work. They're like, they gave support, and people are like, nah, George is king. Nah, that's not going to work. We don't want that. There's no reason. Why? Like, he doesn't earn, like, that doesn't fit. Like, what did he do? They like Edward. He'd already established himself as charismatic, as a winner. Again, tall, warlike, all that stuff. So they just gave up. They're like, all right, never mind. Let him go. Of all the ways for this little episode to end, they're like, you can go back to being king now. Can we be friends again? But no, that's not what happens. We don't become friends again. This is when he switches sides further. So first, Warwick Kingmaker's like, okay, I'm going to take over my own faction from within and push this Edward back down and take charge. That didn't work. So he's like, okay, now I'm going to go to the other faction entirely. I'm going to be a Lancaster. That's what Kingmaker does. But it takes King Louis XI to bring him in. King Louis XI doesn't want Burgundy to go back to England. He's like, well, if Burgundy and England are paired up again, then we're the odd man out. So he steps in, is like, hey, Kingmaker, powerful guy, huh? What if you join with Margaret of Anjou to back Henry and his young son, Edward Joffrey? What if you join our side? And Kingmaker is all for it. He's like, okay, yeah. He's so for it that he's willing to get on his knees to beg Margaret's forgiveness, which Margaret required. So Cersei, you got her like, you will bow to me, you will apologize on your knees. And he does it. Like, interesting. He actually did this. And he swears homage, the Kingmaker does, to Henry VI on a piece of the True Cross, which sounds like a pretty big deal, right? The True Cross, meaning the actual cross that Jesus was crucified on, apparently.
You could call this another parallel to Chris and Cole, the Kingmaker, switching sides like this.
Oh, yeah. Yes, you're right. So he'd already he made Edward king, tried to make George king, and now he's back to putting Henry restoring Henry on the throne. So yeah, this guy is all sorts, no wonder he's called Kingmaker. So as part of this arrangement, Henry VI names George Renly his second heir. So he's officially behind Edward Joffrey now, which, from George's perspective, is like, it wouldn't be hard for me to get rid of that little kid and become king. That's what he's thinking. Meanwhile, Warwick is fully switched to Henry, and George doesn't know it. George still thinks he's the guy that's going to end up being king, where Warwick is just kind of keeping him entertained to keep his army on his side, to keep a Yorkist on his side. But he has no intention of doing that. He's now for Henry and Edward. So, the Kingmaker's daughters are now married to George Renly and Edward Joffrey, right? So he's very invested here. George and Isabel, when they were fleeing to Calais, they had a daughter born at sea, and then she died shortly after. Kind of similar to Missaria and Daemon when Missaria lost her child at sea. That's book only, not show. She lost her child at sea when she was exiled. Little parallel there, I guess. So with this new alliance, Warwick Kingmaker, Margaret d'Anjou, George Renly, with their allies, other Lancastrians who are still out there, they make a two-pronged attack. They come from France, send one army to the south, one to the north. Edward's caught in between, and they basically change places. Edward thinks he can win. He's doing stuff, then he realizes he's trapped, and Kingmaker's brother was on his side. Kingmaker's brother flips to be with the Kingmaker, surprising, not. And so when he hears that, he's like, oh, we're screwed. So they flee to France. They go to Burgundy, where his sister lives, because she's the Duchess of Burgundy. So it's like they trade places. One faction in exile in France takes England, the faction there goes back to France to hide out. Now, Warwick has a third daughter. Or sorry, not a third daughter. My bad. Erase that. Never mind. I didn't say that. So Warwick rules through Henry VI for a short time. Unsurprisingly, this most powerful man that puts Henry, the weakest king ever, on the throne and rules through him. But he goes too far. He overreaches, just like everyone who seems to get this job does. He overreaches. Because of his deal with King Louis, he owes hostility to Burgundy on Louis's behalf. No one in England wants hostilities with Burgundy. They had long-standing merchant relationships, so many marriages, personal and financial, that he would undo by this, and it's a massive fail because he doesn't read the room, and it's like, he should have just betrayed the King of France, apparently. So what happens in Burgundy all along? Remember, what did we say a minute ago? The King of France feared an alliance between Burgundy and England. Well, the Duke of Burgundy, Charles the Bold, feared an alliance between England and France. He didn't want to be the one left out. So it's like this triangle of, we need 2 against 1, and no one wants to be the one. They're like, we want to be on the side of 2 versus 1, not 1 versus 2. So Charles the Bold gives Edward Robert a whole bunch of money and troops, which is, it's his wife's brother that he's helping out here. Let's not forget. Margaret of York is his duchess. So Edward lands like the Golden Company does in Westeros. There's a storm. It's not too bad. It doesn't sink a bunch of ships, but it scatters them. So their army is scattered all over the place. It looks bad, but the Yorkists are unable to take advantage of it, probably because of all this internal division that happened almost immediately after they took the throne back. They immediately start screwing the pooch. So at one point, Edward leads his army to a castle that Warwick is in. Warwick has more men than Edward, but he still is like, I don't want to fight you. I'm not taking the risk. Plus, George is on his way. George is going to help me. George, your brother, is going to beat me. He doesn't actually tell Edward Robert this, but that's his plan. He's like, I'm going to wait. And then when George gets here, we're going to have a way bigger army than you, and we're going to fight you. And we're going to kill you.
Yeah. It's worth noting that, again, I don't know what the numbers were here, but let's just say I have an army of 10,000, you have an army of 13,000.
Yeah.
Even though the 13,000 person still doesn't want that battle. Like, even if you probably will win because you have more, it's not a guarantee, and you're just going to lose a lot of troops. When you have near matched armies, a lot of people die. Yeah, you're right. You want to have like 10,000 to 2,000. That will be a quick, decisive, minimal casualty battle. So.
Yeah, that's when you feel like you're very unlikely to lose. Yeah, you want to win. You want it to be easy. You want to be like a bully. You want your army to be a bully. You want it to be like only win fights that it can win easily. Yeah, that's a good. Because if you don't, then you don't have an army anymore, and then you don't have the power that you had. So
even if you win, your army is so
Pyrrhic victory
beat up from that. Now you'll lose to the next person that attacks you back. You would like to be able to absorb the other army you defeated into your army, but if half of them are dead too, and they're going to hate you more, and all the people the lands are from are going to, it's really bad. So,
yeah, you're right. These are all very important factors. So what actually happens is Edward figures out what's going on, or hears about it. He learns that George is on his way. His younger brother, his traitorous younger brother, George Renly, is coming to help the Kingmaker defeat Robert Edward. But Edward is like, maybe we can win him back. So he sends out some negotiators, and it works. He's like, brother, it wasn't going to work out for you. Kingmaker's not going to make you king. Just come back to us. Like, I'll forgive you if you come back to our side. He's like, yeah, okay, I'll do it. I'll come back. Even though he's married to Warwick's daughter, even though he's married to Kingmaker's daughter, he's like, yeah, I'm coming back. Kingmaker finds out because George says, hey, let's negotiate your surrender. He's like, you switch sides? He doesn't actually say that. He refuses to talk to George. He's like, I'm not even talking to you, Renly. So this is a good way to handle it, right? So eventually it comes to, this battle doesn't happen, but not long after is the Battle of Barnet. It does come to a decisive battle. This is when we talk about one slight difference between Westeros and this period of England is, yes, banners and sigils are a big deal, but they're way more confusing than Westerosi ones. Banners are like, you got like 7 different houses wrapped up into one with like, they're all overlapped and overlaid. It's so damn confusing. And they're less...
Here and there in George's world, someone quarters their banners.
Yeah.
But in the real world, they get 8th all the time.
Yeah, or even more. Sometimes even more than that. Yeah. It's insane. Yeah.
From a distance, you just can't tell what they are.
So what they did was, because this stuff is so damn confusing, they developed the pattern of personal badges that for a household, like Edward the Force was the sun and splendor, right? Margaret's were silver swans. She was handing out silver swans to recruit men. You know, that was their sigil. Henry Tudor, who we're going to see later, is the Red Dragon, which is part of how we get into the Targaryen Blackfire stuff. Richard III, who we haven't really dealt with a whole lot yet. This is Edward Robert's younger brother. His was a white boar. And there's the Richard Rickard had a fetterlock. And the Edward of Westminster, who's Edward Joffrey, also had a swan. This is like a similar to Margaret, because that was his mother. And then the Beauforts had a portcullis, which is kind of like House Ironwood. And in fact, the Beauforts are a little Ironwoodish in their second place to the Martells, although they're older blood than the Martells, which is the reverse here. Anyway, the Battle of Barnet has a lot in common circumstantially with the Battle of the Green Fork, in which there was a lot of confusion, there was fog, and there were some pre-dawn attacks that didn't really work. But that were probably good gambles, but ultimately didn't work. Anyway, this badge thing, I brought up the badges now, because one of the houses, this is the house of Warwick's brother. Warwick's brother, the Marquess of Montague, his house badges were stars. The stars looked a little bit like the sun and splendors. So Montague had just switched sides to his brother's side, faction, whatever. Because of the fog, these two Lancaster armies got confused. And the Marquess of Montague's men, rather the Lancastrians thought the sun and splendor men were the Montague men, and when the Sun and Splendor men attacked, they thought they were being attacked by their own allies, the Marquess of Montague. And since he had just switched sides, they thought he was switching back. They were like, they didn't realize it was just a error in sigil identification. It was actually just a mistake. They thought it was treason. They were like, this is terrible. He's turning on us. Whoops. In the confusion, Warwick himself is knocked off his horse, and he probably would have been a pretty valuable prisoner, but someone dragged him off and chopped his head off. We don't know who. And he's dead. So that's it. Kingmaker. Hugely powerful guy. Maybe the most important figure in this whole thing so far, if anyone is. The biggest mover and shaker, arguably. Just dead, kind of in a confusing incident battle that he could have not unlikely expected to just be captured, but no, killed in this battle, and Edward again wins, and it's another just famous victory for Robert Edward. Kind of like in Robert's Rebellion, where he won a series of victories, but this guy's legend is being built out over a wider range of time. His battles are much farther apart. But let's not forget there was another army, right? The Lancasters had Margaret's army too. There was a whole second army. They wanted to combine. They weren't able to. So the Yorkists stopped the Lancaster armies from combining, whereas prior, the Lancaster armies did not stop the York armies from combining. So it looks like the better military leadership might have been on this side for now, the Yorks, especially with Edward being such a great commander. And his younger brother, Richard Stannis, we call him, is really emerging as a great military commander. Don't get confused. George Renly is older than Richard Stannis, but they're both, the reverse of A Song of Ice and Fire. But they're both younger brothers of our Robert Edward figure here. And they definitely have a lot in common with their A Song of Ice and Fire counterparts. So Margaret didn't want to land. She was cautious with her army. She's like, we're not going to land unless we have confirmation of victory from Warwick. Well, they didn't find out. They didn't know. They didn't find out. So they land, and then they hear about it. And she's like, oh, let's leave. Let's not chance it. But her young son, Joffrey Edward, is old enough to fight now, and he's been dreaming of chopping off heads. That was kind of a job that she gave him. He was like in charge of giving out punishments to prisoners, and he was just like he was an off with your head kind of guy. So yeah, this is why I keep comparing him to Joffrey. He's old enough to make his case now. He's 17. So he's no stranger to violence, but is a stranger to battle. He hasn't actually been in a lot of battles. Meanwhile, the Yorkist guys who are his age counterparts, like Edward and Richard, meaning Edward, Robert, and Stannis, they have a lot of battle experience already, even though they're the same age as this guy. So he convinces his mother to go for it. He convinces his mother, hey, Mom, it's worth it. We should try it. Yeah, it's a gamble, but we should do it. Mom was right. The York, he had a point. Their army was still larger than the Yorkist army, but not by a lot, not by much. And their army was also less popular because of the pillaging before. So it was harder for them to get supplies. It was harder for them to go into towns. Everywhere they went around England, there was a chase. The York army's chasing the Lancaster army around. It became that because the Lancasters were low on supplies and were having a hard time of it. So eventually it comes to a head. They get close to each other and they have to fight. And it's mostly mounted men on the York side versus foot men on the Lancaster side, which is part of why the York men were having an easier time on this chase, because they're mounted and the Lancasters aren't. Margaret goes and sits at a church while the battle's happening. Very much like Cersei during the Battle of the Blackwater. It was like, yep, go pray for the right thing to happen during this battle. It did not. The Yorkists defeat Margaret's army, and Edward Joffrey is killed. Possibly by George Renly himself, directly, who, if you recall, he had been named Henry's second heir before flipping back to his brother's side. So he may have been thinking ahead, like, well, let me get rid of this guy. In case things turn back in my favor, that's one person ahead of me who's no longer in the picture. So he kills Joffrey himself, apparently. This is another Bloody Meadow. It's also called the Bloody Meadow. Even though we already had a Bloody Meadow at Towton, we have another one here at Tewkesbury.
No relief from the confusion if you're trying to study this.
No, there's also lots of drownings with people trying to run away. Yeah, I wrote this note on this one, and then I came back to it and was like, wait, I must have put this in the wrong spot. This was the Battle of Towton. I erased it, and then I came back. I was like, nope, it was both. I had to put it back in there. Oddly, this battle is reenacted every year in July, even now. They reenact the Battle of Tewkesbury in modern times every year. So another Edmund Beaufort is killed in this battle. And that's it for the Beauforts. The male Beauforts are done. They're executed. There's still women Beauforts. There's a Margaret Beaufort. Yes, another Margaret, who is the mother of Henry Tudor, who becomes Henry VII. So very important Henry, very important Margaret still. And who did these it's very important that some of these guys were not killed in the battle. This Edmund, not killed in the battle. Neither, maybe not the Joffrey either. I think the Joffrey was, but a couple of these lords were executed after the battle rather than killed during it. And who oversaw these executions? Richard Stannis. This is going to become a pattern. Richard Stannis is sort of like Robert Edwards' hitman. He's the younger brother that does the dirty work until he eventually tries to become king himself, because he does the dirty work on Edward's family, his own nephews. But very often, Richard, who becomes Richard III, is this guy that is the one that has to do the executions, or who does the executions. Maybe he wasn't told to, he just does it. It helps Robert Edward look like it keeps his hands clean, which was very much a thing in A Song of Ice and Fire. Robert didn't want to have Rhaegar's children on his hands. Didn't want it to be seen like he did that. And to be fair, he didn't. But someone else did the dirty work for him. But it kind of did need to be doing from a dynastic perspective, Not that I condone that, but you know what I mean.
And Tywin was ruthless or whatever enough that he just did it. He knew it was going to have to happen, and did it. And that kind of ingratiates him to Robert, because Robert doesn't even have to ask for it, right?
Yeah.
But you see that Robert understands it. Robert probably would have ended up asking for it because he wants to go kill Dany, even against Ned's will, right?
So. Yeah, you're right. So this was, even though this was a huge win for the Yorkists, like Margaret of Anjou is not killed, but she's done. She's no longer a factor. With her son dead, she just goes home to France. She gets ransomed back to France and is never a factor again.
She's exiled and dies in poverty.
Yeah, exactly. So she's just out of it. She's hurt. You play the Game of Thrones, you win or you die. Her death came later. She didn't quite die right away. She lost everything. It was kind of to a powerful lord. That's almost the same things. They'd rather die a lot of times. Anyway, but they almost lost despite this. They won this battle, but while this battle was happening, while this great victory for York was happening, the bastard of Falkenberg almost took London, which would have been a huge win because they would have freed Henry from the Tower of London and captured Edward's wife and family. How massive would that have been? This would have been like almost what Theon did if he wasn't too stupid to try to do different things. He tried to, he played it wrong. He had a huge victory. He played it horribly, but the taking of Ned's children and all that could have been massive if he had played it right.
Theon won a battle, but thought he won the war. He didn't realize this is just one step in his bigger picture.
Which is also this thing here. So what happened was the Bastard of Falkenberg put it under siege. York had left his wife's brother, Lord Rivers, Elizabeth Woodville's brother. Now, the Woodvilles, there are a lot of them. There's a little bit of Lannister / Tyrell here, so that not only were they up-jumped by marrying Robert Edward, but they did the Tyrell Lannister thing where they just like start popping up everywhere in Edward's government, like titles, council seats, positions. This guy was competent though. This guy actually led the defense of London and was good at it. So this wasn't like a nepotism thing. He was like, this guy did a good job, Lord Rivers.
That is a little footnote I meant to mention earlier. Historians seem to think that was at least part of why Robert married that Woodville girl, was to build a power base outside of Warwick. Like you said, they started lumping all kinds of lands and titles and money on her and her family, just to have some competing power for I say Warwick. What were we calling him here? We were calling him
Warwick Kingmaker.
Yeah, Kingmaker. Thank you. Yeah.
So yeah, you're right about that. There are I kind of brushed it off, just saying he married her because she was hot and he's impulsive because he's like Robert Baratheon in that way too. He's a womanizer and an alcoholic, which we haven't gotten to yet, but we're about to. But you're right. There was a thinking behind it that might have indicated some political savvy that he's not given credit for. And it could have been both. It could have been like, this idea is going to work, and I want it to work because she's hot. Like there's that. There's that possibility. So now the Bastard of Falkenberg is thwarted a bit by Lord Rivers. Lord Rivers, of course, makes you think of like Bloodraven and lots of other rivers. Is obviously a bastard of the Riverlands. So he decides to continue the siege and thinks he can eventually win. But he hears about the Battle of Tewkesbury and is like, "Oh, Edward's dead. Warwick is dead. Like we're toast." So he backs off. He leads his army away and is like tries to peace, please. He doesn't want to fight anymore. And the minute Edward and Richard get back to London, Richard goes to the Tower of London and Henry VI mysteriously dies in prison the same day they get back. Oh, it was broadcast as, he was so sad. Just like he felt catatonic that other time. This time he died because he was so sad about the death of his son, which is slightly believable. I mean, this guy did have an awfully strong reaction to a political loss, a loss of French possessions. The loss of his son, you'd think that would hit him pretty hard. But to kill him, it's awfully convenient for the Yorkists, isn't it? So once again, Richard Stannis is the one that does the deed. History records he was in the Tower of London that night. And again, he's shown himself to be the hatchet man for his older brother several times. All right, now the reign of Edward IV Robert. He's basically defeated his enemies in the field now. The Lancastrians are not eliminated, but they're beaten enough that he doesn't have any immediate threats. He can go ahead and rule and do a good job of that. So a mostly peaceful reign follows. He does some invading. He invades France at one point and gets France to pay him to leave in an annual amount. So he gets another big win for the team. The English throne benefits pretty greatly from that. Here's another Song of Ice and Fire reference, a very obscure one. There's a duke, the Duke of Exeter, who sued for peace. This is the Lord, I believe this is the Lord Falkenberg, whose son was the bastard of Falkenberg that tried to take London. Maybe I'm getting this guy confused. Either way, it's not important. He was forgiven and allowed to be part of the Yorkist government and then sent to France. But on his way to France, he fell overboard with nobody watching. So it's like, that's suspicious, isn't it? So maybe he was probably murdered. And this is remember what Tyrion says to Jacelyn Bywater. He's like, he sends Janos Slint to the wall, and Alar Deem, his second in command. Alar Deem was Janos's hatchet man, the one who murdered babies. So Tyrion's like, we're sending this guy to the wall. Take that Alar Deem guy too, but he shouldn't reach the wall. If he were to fall overboard on the way to the wall, the captain might find himself rewarded or something. It's like, if this were to happen, Tyrion says, and it does happen, because you may recall that Alar Deem never gets to the wall. Janos Slint does, but yeah, this Alar Deem. So we call this being Alar Deemed. Yes. So that happens. George Renly continues to be just unhappy, and he maybe has mental health issues, which that's not necessarily something Renly had, but he just continues his shenanigans. He continues, despite his brother's rule being very successful, and he doesn't have a wealthy, powerful patron in the Kingmaker anymore. One of his retainers, an Oxford astronomer, had imagined, I don't know what this means, but imagined as an astronomer, as a prophecy, whatever that means in this context, imagined the death of King Edward using black magic. Yeah, I mean, this was a thing. But this admission came under torture. Now, why was he being tortured in the first place? I guess because these rumors were out there that... So George Renly basically had his court astronomer hex his brother. Like, that's a good way to think about it. And they took it seriously. They're like, well, if he's trying to hex us, he might be trying to do other stuff. So they just executed him. So this was kind of like Stannis finally executing Renly using a shadow baby to do it, but doing it.
Instead of being executed for using black magic to execute.
Yes! Perfect. That's brilliant. Yeah, I didn't even catch it that way, but you're totally right. So this is when we should talk about how Robert Edward starts to become even more like Robert. The bad parts of Robert Baratheon start to really come out under his reign. As we already pointed out, how the Woodville family rose like a meteor. There's a lot of Tyrell, Lannister, maybe even Frey in there. He's a big drinker. Absolute alcoholic like Robert. Absolute womanizer like Robert. Didn't have as many bastards, and the bastards weren't as big of a problem in this context. But they were a little bit of a problem. And he also just had a lot of children, period. Like a lot of true-born children. I think it was 10. Lots of kids. And so that's not even counting the illegitimate ones. It's not even known how many kids he had. Just like it's not necessarily known how many Robert had. You just can't keep track of all the women he slept with and which one of them had babies, and no one's writing that down. Like, this is not part of the detailed history. Robert's particular partners are not recorded by court historians, you know? And he's getting sicker because of his excess. He's still actually a pretty good statesman. That's one thing he didn't have in common with Robert. He's actually pretty good with money, despite his other bad habits. He expanded the court, invested in things somewhat wisely, definitely didn't leave the court bankrupt, and was a lot more interested in being a ruler, unlike Robert Baratheon, who was just kind of lazy about it. It was like, yeah, once he loved fighting for the throne, but then he kind of just got bored with it. This Edward wasn't bored with ruling. He was just also an alcoholic and a womanizer, rather than that being the only thing Robert kind of was after becoming king. So he's getting sicker and sicker. He's also doing emetics, which are the things that make you throw up. So he's doing like the binge and purge thing, where he eats and drinks a lot, drinks a thing, throws it all up, then just stuffs himself again. Yeah, that's real bad for you. We know, we're only relearning now stuff that ancient folks kind of had figured out without being able to put science behind it, that our gut health is really important to our brain health. I just read a study today that scientists now can tell that someone has been discriminated against based on their gut bacteria. Like within like an 80% accuracy. Like what? Like I literally read that like 2 hours ago. I haven't fully explored the accuracy of that or if it's exaggerated a bit, but that just, whether that's true or not, it just goes to just how powerful gut bacteria is. So if you're binging and purging, like that's horrible for your brain and your body and everything. So he's not long for this one. Your teeth, yeah, you're right. The enamel.
It's a wasteful of money. It's so bad in so many ways. But
so we are faced with a Robert Ned situation. Robert is dying of his ill health. He's in bed, gonna die, dictates terms for how his reign should be the rest of the way. He names Richard Stannis to be his regent. This is where Richard becomes a little more like Ned because of the whole Robert's deathbed and sort of Ned writes out Joffrey by clever wording. This doesn't involve wording, but it does write out the children, and it does happen under similar auspices. Though, in A Song of Ice and Fire, those aren't Robert's children. We know that for a fact. In this case, the charges of illegitimacy are trumped up, most certainly. But the charges of illegitimacy do exist. So this is a 13-year-old boy. He's going to be Edward V. But he's going to be... Richard's going to be his regent first. Richard Stannis is going to be his regent for a few years. Just kind of like it would be in A Song of Ice and Fire. However, a lot of people don't like Richard because he's a hatchet man guy. He's a successful war leader, but he's not charismatic, which is the Ned Stannis angle. He doesn't have his brother's charisma. He doesn't have Renly's charisma. He doesn't have any of that. He's a good ruler. He makes solid decisions, but he's also violent, and he does have a little more, he has more of Stannis' level of ambition than Ned's, where he justifies what he does based on, it's the law. And it was like, there's ambition in there too, you know? It's not just the law. It's not just your duty, Stannis. We know that's part of it, but it's also, you do have some ambition and some pride. So that's where he's more like that. That's a big part of why this Richard is more of a Stannis than anyone. He's also a Tyrion, though. He makes some good decisions and gets some of his best decisions he comes under fire for. He's like, this is one of the best things I did. And you're blaming me for this? Like, why do you blame these people? Like, why are you blaming me? Because I'm ugly? Yes, partly because he's ugly. He had scoliosis. He had a hunchback. And it's not fair. Edward's popularity was in part because he was good looking, tall, handsome. This younger brother, not so much. So a little of a Jaime Tyrion dichotomy almost, because maybe a Stannis Robert, but Book Stannis is tall and handsome too. Not as handsome as Robert. He went bald prematurely, but still, he's a big guy. He's warlike, you know. So this is a little more extreme in that. This is an example of where the real life is more extreme than George's version. So it's the year 1483. Edward dies. He's been king for 22 years. Minus a year where he lost it, and then another few months where he lost it. Twice he lost it briefly, we'll say. So this is, of course, the Stannis Richard is Shakespeare's Richard III. He's going to be Richard III. So he becomes Lord Protector under the terms of his dying brother. He wanted that. But the rest of the court later is pretty quickly like, nah, we don't want this. So they maneuver to say, no, Edward can be king now. He's only 12 or 13, but let's just let him be king now. Edward V, just do it. Bring him on now. Get him started young. New blood. Not a lot of people have their hooks in him yet. He can kind of fresh start, shall we say. A lot of people back this idea. But Richard is the military.
And they all want to get their hooks in him.
Yeah, they want to get exactly. And Richard's like, no, I want to rule, and I'm not putting my hooks in him. I'm just going to cast him aside. He just moves over all of this. So he basically denies this. Edward V is set to just become king, kind of like Daeron I, the young dragon, was just, even though he was only 14, they're like, no, let's just let him go for it. Let him rule. He's ready. That wasn't political. They just thought he was ready, apparently. There was no political reason to let Daeron take the throne. They just figured he was good to go. This was very political. And this poor young Edward, he understands. He's old enough to understand what's happening. We're told that he realized that Richard was pushing him aside. He understood that he wasn't going to get his crown. He understood that Richard was going to hold it back and then never give it to him. And when at first Richard said, hey, we're going to put you in the Tower of London for your own protection, a place that no one has gone to for their protection. It's a prison. What? That's not protection. So he's like, yeah, no, I don't want to go. But Richard's this very successful, powerful military commander. This is the Ned Stark to Robert, who was his number 2 guy, leading all these armies very effectively. And these armies are loyal to him. He started violence in Parliament. He had his men attack. He personally attacked another lord at one point. So this is really getting out of hand. He becomes Richard III. Less than 3 months after pushing his nephews aside, he also puts Edward's younger brother, who's also named Richard. So Edward and Richard, the princes in the tower, are imprisoned. Richard executes, to take them captive, he has to execute that same Lord Rivers, who was the hero of the siege of London, and the Lord Chamberlain. He executes these lords to take possession of the princes. And a sermon happened to be preached in town that was like, Richard should be the king. And it was like, did you pay this guy, Richard? It's very much like the opposite of what we see in Song of Ice and Fire with like the shepherd and some of these preachers that preach against Bloodraven that end up dead. It's like, I don't know about these guys. Was someone paying them? Are they really doing this? Or it didn't take much encouragement, maybe, if they were, But then Richard is like, well, it's not enough just to push these kids aside, because people still see their claims as valid. How do we undo that? Well, Edward IV married in secret. Oh, that marriage. Was that really a legitimate marriage? He had agreed to marry somebody else before that. Not even the French princess. There was another agreement he had made before that. Which,
did you see them get married? I didn't see them get married.
Yeah.
Those kids are just bastards. They're not really the heirs.
So this was the line he puts out. This is his argument, his propaganda. It catches hold. It works pretty well. Obviously, a lot of people see it for what it is. They push back. But once again, Richard kind of has the advantage because of his military power, his position of power, and his willingness to use violence here. Whereas some of the other guys are still kind of like, we're still trying to maintain the status quo where you don't just steal the princes in the streets of London and kill lords to do that. Like, this is really out of hand.
But after 2 have been executed for doing it, who's going to step up and try to protect them now? Like,
it's kind of the reverse of Jaime attacking Ned in the streets after he's went to see Robert's bastards in the brothel, but in reverse here. So because of that, he basically declares them illegitimate, and then becomes king. He declares himself Richard III. Parliament kind of has no choice. They crown him. And some Lancastrians try a commando raid. They try to rescue the princes from the tower. They're like, let's get them out. We can start the whole thing again. It's thwarted. And Richard's like, well, there's one way to make sure that doesn't happen again. Can't rescue the princes if there are no princes to rescue. But he can't just like put their heads up on spikes. That's, even for him, that's going too far. So they just vanish. No one knows what happened to them even now. There has been some excavations and archaeology that weren't available back then that maybe they found their bones now. They're obviously not alive today because this was 500 years ago, but no one knows what happened to them. And this is a story we're not going to get to today, but the fact that they're missing and their bodies were never seen means that there were imposter claimants. There were, here's Edward V. Here he is with an army, there he is. We got him right here. He escaped. See, that's that whole thing about showing heads, establishing certainty was not followed here. I mean, you can understand why Richard didn't show the bodies, because what's he gonna trumpet dead princes of his own nephews? Like,
we'd be comparing him to Theon.
Yes, we would be. And the princes in the tower have a lot of parallels to Theon and Bran and Rickon, somewhat. Like this is one of those examples where George took the basic idea and changed it quite a bit. Yeah. Same with Aegon and Rhaenys, where those were prince and princess in the Tower of the Red Keep that were killed by Gregor and Amory Lorch, maybe under Tywin's orders, but not under Robert's orders, right? It's also kind of similar.
And another one that's a little similar is the boys that Karstark killed.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
But in this case, they were definitively killed, and the result was he was killed for doing it.
Yes.
Richard III, if he had publicly killed those boys, that might not have stood. I think there would have been a violent reaction to him doing that.
I can't believe I didn't think of Rickard Stark killing those 2 Lannister twins, because that is a fantastic parallel as well. 2 royal, like
young boys,
young boys who are twins of each other, and these 2 aren't twins, but they are brothers. It's Richard and Edward, son of Robert Edward, and Richard Stannis had married Kingmaker's daughter Anne. So another Warwick Kingmaker daughter marriage here. So he's got that connection as well. But, and they, of course, have a son. What's that son's name?
Edward.
Yeah. Richard and Anne have.
I had a 1 in 3 chance.
You did.
There's only 3.
It's like 3 names, yeah. So they have an Edward, and this Edward was born a while ago. So during Richard's what will become very brief reign of less than 2 years, this Edward dies. So all of a sudden, his short reign, his already short reign, is in question because he no longer has an obvious heir. He doesn't have any other kids. He has a plan, maybe, because he supposedly really loved Anne Neville. They grew up together, and a lot of the like fictional accounts of this have them having like a romantic connection, including The Sun and Splendor by Sharon K. Penman. But she dies. Maybe mysteriously. He may have killed her, and the reason to argue against it is because he may have really loved her, but there was a political reason for him to do it, which we'll see. It looks bad for him. And there was an eclipse the day of her death. So that looks really bad too, like omen-wise. He is, again, he's a pretty capable king, like Ned was as a hand, or as Tyrion was as a hand, but he just can't overcome all these awful things he did to get to be there, to get there in the first place. His reputation is awful. People don't like him. He didn't get the throne legitimately. It's too much to overcome, even though he's ruling fairly well. And he's validated taking the throne from him by violence because that's what he did. He's kind of like it said it's okay to do this now.
Set the precedent.
Yeah, and that's why we said long ago in this episode why they were really trying hard to not do any of this type of stuff, even when it seemed plain that that's the direction it was going, because if you can maintain that stability, then this back and forth of the crown won't happen. Well, it did happen, but you can see why they tried so hard in vain to stop it.
A little bit of a tangent, but going back before the War of the Roses, I'm pretty sure it was Henry II. There was some contention over the throne, and I think it was Henry II. Rather than take up arms, he appealed to Parliament and said, can you do some research and figure out who it should be? And they had like this investigation into the lineage. It's like, yep, it should be. You actually had the best claim. And boom, and that was it. And so they were trying to establish a precedent of looking to law and the Parliament to determine a king rather than someone has an army.
It makes so much sense, right? Yeah, fight it out in the courtroom, not on the battlefield, right? But that's what they were trying to hold on to, but Richard kind of pushed them away from that, which is part of why a lot of people really look down on Richard historically as someone that brought a lot of violence back to England, because even after the Wars of the Roses are over, which is actually not very far from where we are here, there's still lots of violence that happens after it. We could easily do a follow-up episode, which we might do. I'll pitch that at the end here. Let's keep going. So here's another parallel: the King Across the Water. Viserys was called that. We had other kings that were kind of called the King Across the Water. Daemon Blackfire. Well, his descendants, not actual Daemon, because he was never across the water. He died at the Redgrass Field. So because of Richard's bad ruling and his validation of rule by violence and all that, the Lancaster elements started to coalesce. There was already a bunch of disaffected Lannisters living in France, kind of together, kind of like the Golden Company. But at the beginning, the Golden Company that we're familiar with is like 4th generation exiles. This is like the 1st generation. This is when they first got started. So this is before a lot of them learned to be really great warriors, because they kind of had to be, because they were sellswords. And there are still kind of nobles who were trained at war, but a lot of them aren't like that great at it, or hasn't been their trade for several generations. So lots of Daemon Blackfire, also Viserys Dany, like I said. There's lots of Woodvilles are in this company of exiles, because was one thing that happened with Richard taking over is the Woodvilles got pushed back hard. Like they had gained a lot of power, and then with Edward's death and the usurpation from Edward V, they would have continued if Edward V was part Woodville, but with his disappearance and murder, their connection to the throne was entirely severed. But they want to get back in the game, because that's what happens. So they're in Brittany. Funny that Brittany is where these people want to invade Britain, but this is Brittany as in a place in France.
Of course, in France, yeah.
Yeah. So like I said, it's like a whole city of exiles. There's a whole bunch of them. Their new favorite claimant is Henry Tudor. And let's explain why Henry Tudor is the best candidate for the Lancasters now. First of all, he's the son of Edmund Tudor and Margaret Beaufort. Margaret Beaufort. Remember Margaret Beaufort? Margaret is has all those connections to the Lancasters that they have. She is descended from the same John of Gaunt that all Lancasters derive their claim from. John of Gaunt is the son of Edward III, the guy who started all this bastard feudalism business. So that's a really major thing. So he's a Beaufort. Through his father's side, he's a Tudor and a Valois. Because remember, we said Owen Tudor, who was killed after the Battle of Mortimer's Cross, executed, married Henry VI's mother's, remarried Henry VI's mother, Catherine of Valois. So this is Henry VI's half brother, or was. Now it's his nephew. Well, Henry's dead, so it doesn't really matter. But anyway, he's connected to Henry.
This is more Game of Thrones parallels where people have multiple different relations. They're cousins and nephews or whatever, Yeah.
And supposedly, there's a chance Margaret Beaufort had a affair with a different lord who maybe gives this Edmund and thus Henry Tudor yet another connection to the Lancastering throne. So he may have two different Lancaster branches in addition to Beaufort and Tudor. On top of that, the Tudors claim descent from King Arthur and Calawadir, a Welsh hero who was the last Welsh king. And he has the red dragon badge that the Tudors adopted forever. For long periods of time, Wales's national symbol was the red dragon, and the competing ethnicity, one of the major competing ethnicity in England, the Anglo-Saxons, is the white dragon. So we have the same thing represented here with the roses being white and red, and these families are connected to that same ancestry with these dragons and Wales and Anglo-Saxons. Calawadir's prophecies are not new here. We talked about being connected to Calawadir, this ancient Welsh king. Edward IV cited him as well. As like, hey, I'm the descendant of Calawadir, and he trumpeted his prophecies. So this is a kind of an under the radar thing that's happening. There's a lot of like superstition and astrology, and which doesn't fit with Christianity, yet they did it. So Henry got an ally, the Duke of Buckingham. The Duke of Buckingham had mostly been Lancastrian before, and had one of the Duke of Buckingham's was killed, I think, way back earlier. We didn't bother to mention it, but there was a reason for them to be against the Yorks. And so the Lancasters under Henry Tudor and the Duke of Buckingham were going to do another two-pronged attack on England. They were ready to do this. But Henry's was delayed by storms. They couldn't get there. But Duke of Buckingham didn't know this. He just went right for it anyway. And
they were coming across from France to England, right?
Yeah,
but storms stopped the ships.
And Buckingham was already in England at his castle of Buckingham. And didn't know about the delay and wasn't able to like back off. And so they just started the war prematurely, and just a one-prong attack wasn't so great. So Richard's like, what do? I no longer have my Warwick connection, even though Warwick's dead. I don't have that connection to that family anymore because my wife died. I don't even have an heir. I don't have a son. So I got to do something. So he apparently considers the idea of marrying his own niece. Now, this is very much Daemon trying to marry Rhaenyra. Even in Dance of the Dragon's House of the Dragon, this was unpopular. Viserys was like, no. Even though incest in their world, at least among Targaryens, is acceptable. It's tolerated. We'll say tolerated. But of course, in 15th century England, absolutely not. They're like, no, that's terrible. You can't do that. So Richard Stannis may have floated this idea secretly to see what the reaction would be. It was so negative that he had to step forward and declare that he wasn't going to do it. He had to proclaim, I'm not going to marry my niece. But by that time, he had lost a lot of Northern support. The Northerners, the ones who most hate incest in The Song of Ice and Fire, were turned off by this Yorkist. York is a northern city, flirting with the idea of marrying his niece. And so by the time he made this proclamation, a lot of Northerners had already abandoned his cause.
Did he get certification that he did not have donkey brains?
He did not do that either. He probably should have. Meanwhile, Henry Tudor kind of goes the opposite path. He's like, I want to marry your niece. It's not incest for me, but I could unite the houses. I could be a Lancaster with a York wife. Our children would be both. It would unite the cadet branches of the Plantagenet / Angevin House Plantagenet, whatever. Which, of course, illustrates why Richard wanted to do it, because it would, A, give him a lot of that without the Lancaster tie-in, but it would prevent the Lancasters from marrying her. And he can't just like have her killed, partly because she's hiding in, she's got sanctuary, and even Richard isn't going to like pull her out of the church and cut her head off. Like that's as bad as him killing his nephews publicly.
Am I correct in saying it, aside from, it would have been incest or whatever, this is also like a little girl, right? She's a 12 years old or something.
I forget how young she is, but I think you're right. I don't think she's an adult yet. I think that's a good point. Yeah. I forgot about that. But yeah, so it's bad for a lot of reasons. And yeah,
I might be wrong, but I know there's a couple of the marriages in this time period are like 15-ish year old to 25-ish.
Well, Edward was only 40 when he died. Robert Edward was only 40, so it makes sense that he had like 10 children, so he would definitely have some of his kids would be pretty young. Anyway, let's not get hung up on that. So Henry Tudor invades the second time. This time there's no storms. And it's interesting. He goes all the way around England and lands in Wales. So he sails south around the bottom and comes in through the west, lands in Wales. Here's where we have to talk about House Stanley. House Stanley has a lot of House Frey, but imagine they are a lot smarter, a lot more savvy with their maneuvers, a lot less brutal, a lot more subtle. House Stanley had supported the Lancastrians 100 years prior. Okay? Then, early in the Wars of the Roses, they switched to York. The current Lord Stanley had married one of the Kingmaker's sisters. Not one of his daughters, one of his sisters. Then he switched to Kingmaker's side when Kingmaker switches to the Lancastrians. So he switches away from the Yorks with the Kingmaker, partly because he's married to Kingmaker's sister. Then he marries this same Margaret Beaufort, who is Henry Tudor's mother. But she remarries also. So he's got multiple connections to Lancaster, but he also has connections to York. So it's like, and he's very careful at that. He's very careful to make sure he has lots of connections to both. So it's not obvious which side he's on. In other words, he marries Henry Tudor's mother, which looks really bad, but he's also a stalwart military leader for Robert Edward. And then for Richard, he keeps fighting for Richard. And his son, Stanley's first son and heir, is married to a Woodville. So he's got multiple threads connecting him to both parties very thickly. None of these are easily severed ties. So neither of them what that ends up doing is instead of both sides not trusting him, they both don't want to upset him because they're like, well, this guy's really powerful. We've got enough clout to maybe get him on our side. Last thing we want to do is push him into the hands of our enemy.
They'd rather him stay neutral than be an enemy. Right?
Absolutely. Number one would be an ally, but the worst case scenario is to be an enemy. So Stanley marched his army separately from Henry Tudor, but he did march his army into mainland England as if he was preparing to fight, but for who? He didn't join the army himself, though. He claimed he had some kind of sweating sickness, which that's a term we hear in A Song of Ice and Fire. When the actual battle begins, first of all, Richard hears about this, and Richard does the kind of thing Richard does, a violent negotiation. Stanley's son, that same son that we said was married to a Woodville, was in London when all this happened. Richard seized him and said, hey, Stanley, if you take the Lancastrian side, or the Tudor side, because they're calling themselves Tudors, even though they're related to the Lancastrians, if you take the Tudor side, I'm chopping his head off. And supposedly Stanley gave a Walder Frey-like answer. He said, sire, I have other sons. Now, we've also seen that from a few other figures in A Song of Ice and Fire history, but it's so badass, but also like it's bluff, sort of. He's like, do you really want to piss me off? I am still Lord Stanley. I'm still a powerful ally that you wanted to have on your side. Do you really want to do that? So either way, there's this significant army just sitting there, undeclared, saying, I'll probably, and everybody can kind of read the writing on the wall. He's going to take whatever side is winning. He's going to jump onto the winning side. He's going to say, okay, they're winning. I'm going to make this a decisive victory because I'm going to join it. And both sides know that. They're like, And that's got to affect their battle plan. Like, we got to get out to a quick lead here, or that guy's going to join them. We got to get him on our side. The only way to make sure that happens is to be winning. We have to look like we're winning. It has to be obvious, right? So Richard takes this to lesson. Richard is no slouch. Violent guy, brave guy. Politically not the most savvy, also kind of like a Ned or a Stannis. That's where those parallels continue to pop up. He charges at Henry Tudor himself to try to take them out, like just to kill him in single combat or just to kill him and end the threat right there. Pretty ballsy thing to do. For some reason in the battle, he takes his helmet off, probably because it was damaged, like eye slit, he can't see. In those moments where he took his helmet off, they really came for him and he wasn't able to get it back on. He took a lot of blows to the head, killed him, dies with like pieces of his head are hacked off, like real bad, real bloody, real nasty. So he almost kills Henry Tudor, but instead gets killed himself. They cut his head off. They call him a boar. Remember, his sigil is a white boar, which is kind of relates to the white rose and the white dragon, all that. They definitely behead him and put his head on a pike to prove he's dead, right? They got to do that. Also like Ned and maybe like Stannis. We don't know what Stannis' fate is yet, so that's part of the comparisons fall off when we have an incomplete A Song of Ice and Fire to compare this to. And it was the Stanleys themselves that recovered the crown from Richard's head. Kind of like how the Freys took the crown off of Rob's head and sewed it on the wolf's head afterwards. So there's a little bit of a light parallel there. Richard was the last English king killed in battle. And this was kind of the last battle of the war, depending on what you call the last battle of the war. But this is the end of the Yorks as a claimant to the throne. So this is where a lot of people call it the end of the war. And that's a fair thing for us to call it too. So we have one section left. And then I'll set up what we'll do next time, because we had a lot of things we didn't talk about that we could talk about some other time. Henry VII. Wars of the Roses ends. This is the year 1487. 32 years after that battle at St. Albans where very few people died, but it was just those very important lords, that very crucial people. So Henry Tudor becomes King Henry VII, and luckily for England, Richard had no heirs, so that's why it was kind of done. We did say earlier that there will be some imposter claimants pretending to be Edward's kids later, but
his cousins from the Tower.
Yeah, again, that's
brothers from the Tower.
No, nephews. Yeah, nephews.
Yeah.
So we'll talk about them separately, because they fit into the like post-war era that might make a good separate episode. So
I will say real quick there, much like a Game of Thrones, this War of the Roses, there's like even this last battle, like, well, that's the end of the story. No, there's still all these people and this follow-up. It adds to my like, I don't know what word to use, concern or bogglement of how George can possibly end this. There's not. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, it is difficult. Endings are the hardest part. So this was the Battle of Bosworth Field. Y'all may have heard that name before. This is where the final battle of the war, where Richard is killed and all that, is made very famous by Shakespeare. Supposedly Richard is shouting, "Traitors, traitors," as he's dying and all that. So yeah, there is a lot more after that is often just considered a separate thing. So Henry VII also took the throne without being married. Rightly said, he did eventually marry that the same Elizabeth that Richard said, "Hey, I'm not going to marry her. I'm not going to marry my own niece." And Henry Tudor's like, "I will, because that's not incestuous. And what a great way to combine the branches." So he did do that. And his second son, their second son, Henry, became Henry VIII. So that's a whole other thing. Now, he ruled for 24 years, and his reign was certainly pocked by... First, he was a very strong, kind of authoritative and, well-made ruler. But his first son, Arthur, died when he was a teenager, and he was kind of broken by that and wasn't as good of a ruler. He became very paranoid after that and was more intent on going after people with Yorkist blood, even if they were not really a threat. Some of them actually were, though. So anyway, he was portrayed on the show, Henry VIII on the show The Tudors by Jonathan Rhys Meyers. George R. Martin thought he was terrible. I didn't think he was very good either. Sean, do you remember the show Vikings? Do you remember the character Bishop Haymond?
I remember that guy. Yeah.
Bishop Haymond was a real figure. He was a real actual historical figure who was a zealot warrior monk, warrior priest. Jonathan Rhys Meyers is like, he's kind of a one-note actor where he's just always intense. Like, he can't, everything is intense and really, that's all he can do. And that, as a zealot warrior monk, it worked out well. But not as Henry VIII, it didn't work out as well.
Yeah, that show Vikings had a lot of elements were over the top. I don't think I would say the show was over the top, but some elements were. But that guy was one element that was over the top, yeah.
So here's a few questions from y'all that we'll answer, and what we'll save for another time is a lot of the character and house parallels. I do want to sneak in the Sharon K. Penman bit, so let's rush through these questions and do that. Dornish Dame says, also like House Swan is a parallel to the Stanleys. Both families like the idea of having a son on each side, so they always win. Yeah, that's a good call. The Hightowers did that at one point as well. There's a couple other examples. Guilty Undertaker says Ambrose Butterwell during the Blackfire Rebellions. Yes, good point. The first one. Dornish Dame also says, I like Henry Tudor's uncle Jasper as a parallel for John Connington, the father figure who protects the young claimant. Yeah, Jasper was the younger brother of Edmund Tudor. Edmund Tudor was the father of Henry, and Jasper was hyper loyal to his nephew Henry, who became king, and was massively rewarded for his long-standing support of Henry through all his years of exile and then his taking of the throne. So that's a good point. Good parallel for John Connington. I like that a lot. And in the sense, he says that Dornish Dame says, they say that this loyalty to Richard parallels that of John Connington to Rhaegar. Yeah, that very much so. Kind of their older brother instead of their lover in this case. Edmund Tudor being the older brother of Jasper Tudor. And Dornish Dame says, speaking of Edward's children, I like his daughter Bridget as a parallel to Miguel in the sense that both were raised with the intention of giving them to the church. Yeah. Edward had so many children that some of them were, or at least one of them was earmarked for the church, which is obviously that we see that happen in A Song of Ice and Fire with girls being sent to the Silent Sisters. A lot of times that's as a punishment, but sometimes they're sent to the Sept, like Sarah Targaryen was sent there. Araya was kind of concealed there for a while, and etc. There's some other examples there. Tyrell's is a Woodville parallel is there that we suggested. New Money, king remarrying a woman whose dead husband fought on the other side. Yeah, I like that one. I also like the Tyrells as a Tudor parallel. The Tudors have descent from a royal seneschal, which the Tyrells are descent from a royal steward, which is the same thing. But anyway, we'll save some of that for the character, the house parallels that we didn't have time for today. Let's finish off with this fun bit on Sharon K. Penman. Scrolling. If you want to read fictionalized versions of what I just gave you, of what we just delivered to you, the three of us, I recommend The Sun in Splendor. It's SUNNE in Splendor. There's a book by her called Lionheart, which is a book about Richard the Lionheart. So that's, of course, predates this. Well, the era predates this book, but she wrote Sun in Splendor before Lionheart. And that's our cat, Jakin, a side-by-side of him as a kitten next to the book Lionheart and as an adult cat, also next to the same book. Yeah.
That's a before and after. If you read the book, you're going to grow up and get real big.
That's correct. Yes, that's right. Yes. You can find, go to our website, historyofwesteros.com, and you can get links to buy that book on Amazon or through Audible if you want to listen to it. But let's talk about why The Sun in Splendor is such a great book. Here is what George R. Martin said about her and her obsessive knowledge of the period.
Sharon K. Penman is the strongest historical novelist working the medieval period at present, a worthy heir to two of my all-time favorites, Thomas B. Costain and Nigel Tranter.
I don't know anything about Nigel Tranter. We obviously referred to Thomas Costain earlier in the episode.
His first name's Nigel. You know something about it.
I know that. You're right. Corrected again. Shay has always corrected me correctly. Sadly, Sharon K. Penman is no longer working at present. She passed in 2021. So obviously that quote from George came before that. She had pneumonia. She died at age 75. Her work lives on. I've read 9 of her 14 books. The first being The Sun in Splendor. It really got me in because, like, wow. The Song of Ice and Fire parallels come out really well with her portrayals of these characters. Obviously, she wasn't doing that on purpose. It was written before that. It was written before Song of Ice and Fire. So I think you will very much enjoy it. It's really fantastic on its own. But it's just the fact that it has so many great Song of Ice and Parallels will make you love it even more, I think. It'll make it even more of an enjoyable read. And hopefully I've given you, with the great help of Ashaya and Sean here, some additional ability to understand the events, some additional context. Like you won't go in confused. Because if you're reading A Song of Ice and Fire for the first time, you're like, it's hard to keep track of all the houses and politics. Having a primer ahead of time I would have done well to have that at the time. So anyway, she wrote also the book When Christ and His Saints Slept, which is a great read and has follow-ups, which is about the anarchy, which is the period of history where the Dance of the Dragons is the main influence. So George has multiple big historical influences, and Sharon K. Penman has written both of them.
It's kind of funny you said that as if the dance was the influence on the anarchy.
Oh, did I say it backwards? That's funny. And the anarchy was about 400 years before the Wars of the Roses. The Dance of the Dragons was, about 170 years before the Song of Ice and Fire. So that's pretty cool. Now, The Sun and Splendor is mostly framed from Richard III's perspective. Like, he's the main POV. There are other POVs. It's a POV style book, so that sells it even more to y'all, I know. But yeah, just the actual characterizations really illuminates those parallels. You really get the Ned and Stannis out of Richard III from this book, and you, of course, you get the Robert Baratheon parallel to Edward. Like I said earlier, it's harder for us to draw conclusions about the ending because we don't have an ending for A Song of Ice and Fire. But we do have theories, of course. Some of these will align. We're going to find ourselves by the end of things going, oh yeah, that was a Wars of the Roses parallel too. That was a little, there's going to be a few more. There's the Battle of Agincourt, which was technically in the Wars of the 100 Years' War, not the Wars of the Roses, but that's a good example. There's a lot of people, myself included, who think there's going to be something like the Battle of Agincourt in the Stormlands, which the Golden Company fights the Lannister Tyrell forces. So, good example of something that we're looking at, like, yeah, the Golden Company. We're going to see elements of that from these French exiles and these Tudor exiles and these Lancastrian exiles, some of that. But to how it's going to play out, well, we don't know yet. So yes, the Wars of the Roses and the Middle Ages ended together here at 1487 in England. Like I said at the beginning, the end of the Middle Ages, medieval period, depends on who you ask and what country you're in. But yeah, this post era is where I'm going to pitch another episode to y'all. This is the era that gave George a lot of the inspiration for the Blackfire rebellions and a lot of the imposter claimants that we see in his world, like the fake Darons and Gaiman Palehair and Aegon, aka Young Griff. That's where these figures, the inspiration for these figures come from, is this post-War of the Roses era. In other words, though there were no longer Yorkist claimants to the throne after the Wars of the Roses, there were fake Yorkist claimants to the Wars of the Roses. And real quick, don't be confused by the term pretender. Pretender to the throne is just someone with a claim, but someone without the best claim, like Renly. Renly was a pretender because someone had a better claim than him, obviously, but he had a claim.
Yeah.
Daemon Blackfire is another example. Like, Daemon had a claim, but he clearly didn't have a better claim than the guy who was already king, not by legally. So Stannis is sometimes called a pretender because people don't know that it's true that Robert's children are bastards. In reality, Stannis' claim is correct, but it isn't necessarily seen that way because the proof isn't there.
The powers that be want to downplay someone claiming to have a claim, right? So they're going to call him a pretender. And it makes it sound like they don't have any claim at all. But they do. They just have a ostensibly less legitimate claims.
Yeah. So, I hope you have enjoyed our episode today. If you want to, like I said, if you want to check out more on this, get The Sun and Splendor, go to our website, get that on Audible. If you sign up on Audible through us, you get a free subscription, a free book. You can use that, spend that one on The Sun and Splendor. You can also get one of the books I used to research this topic, The Wars of the Roses. It's just called The Wars of the Roses by the author Dan Jones. And it's very good. It starts well before the Wars of the Roses and ends well after it. Lots of context, all the kind of stuff you want. Very well detailed. And I'm pretty sure it's free on Audible. So if you have an Audible subscription, you get, because I bought it and then I was like, wait, it didn't charge me a credit. So I think it was free. Anyway.
Is that dramatization or is it like
it's history? No, it's straight history. Yeah. So if you want the straight history, Dan Jones, I recommend that. If you want a great fictionalized account, The Sun and Splendor by Sharon K. Penman.
I'm curious, how many pages do you don't know off the top of your head? Is it like 500-page book, 2,000-page book?
Sharon K. Penman book? Or
that one too. I meant more the
no, the Sharon K. Penman book is roughly the size of a Game of Thrones size book. It's very big. The Wars of the Roses, Dan Jones, I listened to it, so I'm not as sure of how long it is, but it was 17 hours, which is more than half the length of Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones is about 30 hours. So This is about 17, 18 hours.
So maybe 500, 600 pages. But I bet it's a dense read. It's like it might be less dense given all the research I've done for this episode, but man, I bet there's a lot of like, wait, which Henry is this?
Oh yeah. Definitely. But it's really fun. If you want to explore the topic more, definitely do that. Go to our website, follow those links, get whichever books or audiobooks you want to get to go deeper, and let us know if you want to see us follow this up. If you want to see us cover, we could do an episode on the Anarchy where we draw the parallels to the Dance of the Dragons to show that. We could do an episode on the post Wars of the Roses era that showed the parallels to the Blackfires and these imposter claimants, alongside a lot of other kind of miscellaneous parallels, influences on George R. R. Martin. These aren't always just neatly confined to certain historical periods or centered around the major events. So anyway,
a prelude to this might be interesting too, especially if we're going to compare the Plantagenets to the Targaryens or something, you know.
I'm definitely going to continue with this. I'm going to listen to more audio, but I'm in. I'm like, I was already in, now I'm more in. I'm like you said, Sean, you got more and more invested in it. I'm like, I'm not done with this yet. I'm not ready to be done. I want to read more and listen to more, and we'll see what happens.
My first few sessions of this was like a headache. It was like a college, trying to write a college paper about history. It's like an assignment, you know, something I had to do and couldn't figure it out. But by the end of it, I went to bed at night thinking about it. I went to bed like thinking, but feeling bad for Richard, or wondering what they could have done differently, or certain things I hadn't finished yet. It's also, I've pointed this too out about just kind of like a Game of Thrones, the writings of George Martin. Just because you read it, there's difference between having read it one time and fully understanding everything in it. So there are certain things in the beginning I would read, but my brain just hadn't processed it all. I couldn't remember the different characters. I hadn't pieced together the timeline. But once I started to get that all together, even things I knew because I had read at one point, I didn't remember later on when I read that someone died. It meant more to me, right?
Yeah.
When I knew that character's story than just like a blip on a timeline, So
it's
obviously they're all gonna die, right? But
you have touched on the reason why I say at the end of every episode, Valar reread us, because that is exactly what you get by rereads. You can't get it all. You cannot. It's too complicated to get it on one read unless you're some sort of damn genius of a sort that I am unfamiliar with.
Even if somehow theoretically you could absorb all the data, you can't process the emotion connected to it.
True that. Yeah. That's why this stuff has so much reusable value, why we keep coming back to it, and it continues to deliver for us. Anyway, we've had a long episode today. Let's call it here. Thanks to everybody who participated. Thanks for your questions. Thanks for your thoughts. Thanks in advance for your input on this topic. Thanks to the patrons who chose this at Topics Moot. I was very pleased to see it chosen. I knew it wasn't such a topic I could handle lightly. It needed to be something y'all picked for me to justify putting this much effort into it. I'm very glad of that. I mentioned our episode, A Song of Ice and Fire in Rome, which was an episode we did earlier this year. That was also chosen at Topics Moot and has had a little bit of a tie into this. We talk about the inspiration of some ancient topic, large topic on George R. R. Martin's writing. Thanks also to Nina for her takes here. There were lots of them in here. She probably went into this episode knowing the topic better than any of us. I'd like to think I caught up quite a bit, but nevertheless, her help was invaluable. Thanks as well to our History of Westeros music people. That's Joey Townsend, Jesse Koval, and Bran the Builder. We sure do appreciate them. Also, Michael Klarfeld for his video intro, which incorporates some of this music. And we hope to see you next time soon for more. And you know what to do. I just explained it. Valar reread us.